They called him Enoch in whispers, a name that did not belong to the legends of Greece, but that felt right in the quiet way the sea remembers a storm. It was an easy syllable to throw against the wind, soft and abrupt at once, and it gathered weight as soon as it was spoken aloud. The people who would later call him cursed at his heels, his name became a word for quiet dread and stubborn fate. In the beginning, though, he was only a secret kept between a warrior and a woman who would not speak his name to anyone else. He was just a secret once, then a name everyone feared. Subscribe and share in the comments if what hit you harder was how it began or what it became. Achilles kept many things to himself, though his anger was public and legendary. He kept the shape of his grief the way a man keeps a map folded into his breast, the creases permanent and unreadable to anyone else. When the war ended and Hector's dust settled, when the long lists of slaughter were recited and the songs hummed their thin praise, Achilles turned inward. There was a wound that had nothing to do with spears or bronze, and it opened in a room lit by a lamp and the slow breathing of two people who were tired of being gods to a world that expected only ash. The mother of the child was not a goddess in the usual way, not a nymph that swam in clear rivers, nor a daughter of a king who smiled for favors. She was a woman with a strange steadiness, a seamstress from a coastal town who mended fishing nets and stitched the hems of garments that would never be sung about. She had eyes that moved like the sea at low tide, tracking something deeper than the surface, and Achilles believed in her in a way that frightened him. That belief made the child possible, just as the sea makes gulls possible by refusing to hold them back. There are things people forget about the great heroes. They forgot that Achilles could be soft in secret, that his muscles could unclench and stay that way when the right hand slid into his. There are intimacies no chorus recorded, and yet the night the child was conceived felt like a page torn from an older world where heroes could be tender and small things mattered. They spoke of other lives briefly, of warm bread, of the smell of linen, and of a future that would not need bronze. Fate, as it so often does, listened in and altered its own course a little, like a river nudging a reed. Word found its way to Thetis, as rumor always does to parents who float between care and possession. Thetis listened without surprise. The sea goddess had never pretended to be unaware of the body's ways. She came with a soft, briny voice and an expression as neutral as tidewater. She saw Achilles' face, the way his jaw worked when he tried to be fierce and failed, and Thetis remembered older prophecies she had been told in the long hours before he was born. The prophecy she remembered was not hers to forget. The fates had spoken of Achilles in clipped threads, of a boy who would die in his prime, or live long and unknown. They had drawn lines and left room for choices, and yet prophecy is a net that catches what it can. Thetis saw the possibility of new threads, of a child who might carry forward what was unstoppable in his father and what could destroy him. She held silence like a shield, but the shield had a seam. When the pregnancy revealed itself in the woman's quiet body, it did so not as a banner but as a slow, honest truth. She did not cry triumph, nor did she hide in shame. She moved as one who understood the ordinary miracle of growth. Achilles hovered at the edge of the room, hands idle, not because he lacked courage, but because he had never felt so much to lose. The small sounds of the household, a kettle, a door closing, smelled like the future, and he could not reconcile that future with the flash and heat he had always worn like armor. Seers were consulted not for curiosity but because the sea goddess is careful with knowledge. A blind man with a face folded by years and smoke came walking like a tree that had learned to listen. He tasted words like herbs, and when he spoke of omens he used a slow, measured voice. He felt the child's fate not in the strict lines of doom but in a hesitant pulse that suggested danger folded into blessing. The omens gathered like clouds. A red fish washed up in the harbor without a belly, its color bleeding into the sand. A child in the next village was born with a black spot on the heel, and his parents shut him in a room until it faded. The hearth threw shadows that looked like human hands, and the nightingales sang in timbre that suggested they were not quite themselves. People began to whisper, as people will, and whispers become currents that lift even the strongest boat. Achilles listened to these murmurs with a patience he had rarely employed. He had slain men and he had laid bare cities in song, but the petty fears of townsfolk bit at him with a new edge. They did not trouble him for their cruelty so much as for their truth. Omen or not, the world needs a name for what it fears. He began to think of Enoch as a thing that could be protected, and that thought made him both gentle and violent in ways that confused onlookers. The mother of Enoch kept to herself the small rituals that women of the sea childbirth practiced. She wrapped her belly in linen that had been salted and dried, she carried a small jar of seawater where she slept, and she ate figs that had been roasted to a certain smokiness. These acts were not superstition so much as attention, and attention is a kind of magic. Her hands, when they smoothed the belly, left a wake of calm and a sense that someone was being prepared for a world that would not be kind. The labor began on a night when the wind had decided to stand all the way up and shout. The room seemed lit by a light that was not candle or moon but something more intimate, as if a memory were making its own illumination. The mother breathed and pushed and made a sound that was older than language, and Achilles sat with clenched fingers on the chair, hearing a new rhythm in his chest. For hours time folded into itself, and outside the horizon the sea kept its patient, tireless lap. When the child first came out, the midwife held him up as if he were a coin glinting in sunlight. He was fiercely alive and small, the way all newborns are, and yet there was an oddness no one could name. His skin was the color of wet sand and his hair lay in dark whirls as if the tide had combed it. The midwife frowned and then laughed with relief, an absurd laughter that broke the tension like thin glass. They named him Enoch because the name carried the weight of being other, of not belonging to the standard litany of heroes and saints the Achaeans invoked. Achilles placed the child in his arms like something dangerous and precious all at once. The baby did not cry at first. He looked up with an intensity that felt like prophecy without context. It was a look that said he knew already the stories men would tell about him, and that he was amused. As weeks slipped into months, small uncanny things accumulated around Enoch. Birds would steady him for long minutes and then take off in sudden, coordinated shifts that made people call them omens. Dogs would refuse to greet him, lowering their heads and curling their lips as if they smelled some old sorrow. A lamp would gutter when he laughed and flare when he slept. These things made the villagers ask subtle questions and to lock doors they had never locked before. Achilles learned early the art of keeping two lives parallel, the public warrior and the private father. In public he drank and sang the old songs and let his laughter sound like breaking oars. In private he sat by the small cot and watched Enoch's breath rise and fall, tracing the outline of his face with fingers and used to gentleness. He tried to teach him the small things of being a man of consequence, how to bind a wound, how to stand with a spear, but found himself more inclined to teach patience, how to read the weather, how to listen to the sea. Thetis watched with a sea-blue patience that never survived well in rooms full of warm breath. She leaned across the margin of her son's life like a tide just bending toward shore. She offered enamel bowls of seawater for Enoch to bathe in, and she spoke to him in a language that came from the foam between waves. Achilles did not always like the way Thetis presided over the child, for there was an ownership to the goddess that Achilles, in his mortal way, resented. He did not voice it. Instead, he made a point to be present, to press himself into fatherhood like clay into mold. But Thetis could not be entirely dissuaded. She had dreams that fingered into Achilles' sleep, visions of a boy whose feet never quite touched the ground, whose shadow cast two directions. In these dreams the child walked into fires that were not flames but decisions, and the gods gathered like nervous guests at a funeral. Thetis feared that the boy would inherit more than Achilles' heroic muscle, that he might inherit a longer and darker tether to the kingdom of pain that attends greatness. People speculated without the courage to say the word curse. Curses are spoken of like weather in spring. They may come, they may not, but you pack a cloak anyway. The midwife was old and her hands had seen much. She cursed the rumor openly once, not with malice but with resignation. She spoke of lineage and consequence, of how the sorrow of fathers is a contagious thing and how heroes beget weight. Her words inked themselves into the town's gossip like a steady drizzle. Enoch grew with a peculiar stillness to him, a way of watching that made adults uncomfortable. He would stand on the cliff and not speak to anyone for hours, his small hands clenched at the skirts of his tunic. When children chased each other and played, he observed with a clinical calm that adults interpreted as remoteness. They did not know, could not know, that his eyes catalogued faces like ships registering on a map, storing motion and gesture for some future reckoning. At 3 he surprised Achilles by mimicking the old man's grimace when he was angry, and Achilles laughed with such sudden love it startled the boy into a smile. That laugh did more for Achilles than any banquet would have. It let him be a man who could love without being the man of smashing strength for a moment at least, and Enoch replied with small, absurd gestures that made Achilles soft in ways he did not plan for and would not fully understand. But the town's unease persisted like grit underfoot. Women muttered about portents while they kneaded dough, men announced wagers over who would live to be old. Old sailors crossed themselves when the boy passed. People do not readily confess fear of children, so their fear became 1,000 small inconveniences. Invitations turned into a measured hospitality, rooms were kept purer than before, and the local priest watched with a thin smile that hid vigilant concern. The social clock ticked and hesitation became habit. One afternoon a shepherd's lamb was found with a peculiar marking across its flank, a line like a scar that matched the curve of a heel. It was absurd to tie such an animal accident to a child, and yet the shepherd stood with his wooden staff and asked that the boy be kept under watch. Achilles fumed, not at the lamb but at the superstition. He could wrestle lions with understatements in his voice, but he could not silence the slow machinery of fear that grind people into corners. The first real act of violence reached them like a rumor made real. A man who owed nothing to Achilles came to the house with a knife sharpened on a stone and eyes that had been made narrow by drink. He meant to do some small wrong, a shove, a threat, perhaps because bad luck finds gestures when it cannot find full form. Enoch moved like a shadow and a muscle, intervening with a child's quickness and an odd ferocity. The man fell and whispered something like a prayer before the life left him. The village was stunned silent. That night, a council formed with the careful hatred of men who are afraid of ruin but unwilling to admit their own cowardice. They spoke in breathless tones about the omen and the knife, about the way it might cost them more than their courage. Achilles sat in the center like a pillar, his face as taut as rope. He listened, and when he spoke, his words were measured but not kind. He would take his son away if that was what it required. The resolve in his voice made the villagers quiet as if someone had put a hand on their hearts. Achilles meant it for a moment and for many. He considered leaving with Enoch, taking him to some island where nobody had met his name. Thetis, however, invoked obligations like chains. She reminded Achilles that heroes cannot always hide, that their stories are pulled by the very gods who make them. He faltered, torn between the way Thetis spoke of destiny like inevitability and his gut's desire to run. Decisions are like waves, one may be refused, but the sea knows how to return. Meanwhile Enoch grew taller and quieter, the boy's gait changing in ways that suggested he was inheriting the way of people used to being carried by stories. He learned to swing a blade like a child learning a toy, clumsy and earnest. He also learned to sing to the sea with a voice that was barely a whisper, and Thetis would immerse her hands in his hair and listen to the half-melodies that sounded like old rains. Each skill was a potential, each melody a map that could lead him toward heroism or ruin. When he was 8, Enoch dreamed of a house made of bone and glass, of strangers moving like shadows through halls of memory. He woke with his heart pounding and the taste of salt on his tongue. Dreams have a way of teaching things before the waking world does. This one taught Enoch how to carry fear without surrendering to it. He began, in small ways, to test the contour of his own life, to sketch boundaries that would not be crossed by the town's fear. As adolescence arrived, so did questions no one asked aloud. Enoch's body began to take on shapes reminiscent of Achilles, the long limb, the tension in a calf, the way a shoulder coiled. The town's whispers hardened into certainty. Some said he would be a hero like his father, others said he would be worse. Enoch moved through these judgments like someone walking through rain. He did not stop it, but he learned how to tilt his head to make the drops fall differently. That tilt became a defense. Achilles taught him the blade with an affection that shocked even those used to his ferocity. He taught him balance and how to breath in rhythm with a swing. He taught him the story of how courage had best be joined with mercy. Yet Achilles also taught him how to be ruthless when the situation demanded. Fathers confuse children with such gifts. They think they are preparing them, and instead they are giving them the tools to inherit the parents' burdens. Achilles did not notice how heavy the gifts were when he handed them over. Despite offers and threats, Enoch found friends among other children, boys and girls with dirt under their nails and wild hair. He played at first in a way that seemed healthy, chasing, laughing, and falling into the sea to be hauled out by the same hands that then scolded. Friendship anchored him like rope tied to a boat. Those bonds kept him honest, kept him from slipping entirely into the language of fate that seemed to surround his family like fog. The gods, whose attention is as fickle as a market crowd, began to look at Enoch with an interest that was a mixture of curiosity and boredom. Minor deities came to observe him, not out of the dramatic gestures of Olympian drama, but as one might watch a new vine to see how it climbs a trellis. Hermes came whispering jokes and small favors. Aphrodite passed without notice and then lingered only because a face like Enoch's was rare and interesting. The gods think in large shapes, and this boy was a small experiment at the edge of things. But not every god is tempted to play. Some moved like gravity. Athena, who values strategy and sharp thought, watched and considered Enoch as one might consider a gambit in a long game. She admired the way he listened, the way he apprenticed himself to small talents. Her attention was not patronizing, it was quietly analytical, and that made Achilles proud and wary in equal measure. For a warrior, Athena's regard feels like the sharpening of a blade and the placing of a hand on a shoulder. There were also darker attentions. An old god of misfortune, the kind that slides through old stones and rotten wood, took notice and smiled in a way that made the air tighten. He saw what the townsfolk called a curse, and he wanted to feed it, to make a story where pattern and sorrow became inevitable. Misfortune is not always dramatic. It is a careful artist that arranges little disasters so they appear to be inevitable. It began by loosening rope knots and hiding keys and leaving crumbs of tragedy like a breadcrumb trail. Enoch, unaware of the confluence of divine glances, continued to grow. He read by lamplight with a determination that made Achilles proud to the point of being ridiculous. He wanted to know the names of things. He wanted to put language on the swirl of unease that seemed to follow him like an animal on a leash. Books became a kind of refuge, and the words he collected made him into a librarian of minor truths. He stitched his own map of meaning, and in that map was the beginning of a power that was not muscle-made. By his early teens, Enoch had become an odd combination, fierce when forced, reflective when free. People began to say, in tones that suggested both awe and dread, that he had his father's might and his mother's secret steadiness. But myths do not tolerate such blends quietly, they prefer their ingredients to be pure and loud. Thus the story of the cursed son started to gather friction like flint on steel. An oracle from Delphi eventually sent word, because omens grow teeth and must be sharpened somewhere. The priestess spoke not with the florid drama of prophecy for the masses, but with a clinical precision that felt like an incision. She said that Enoch would be a turning point, that his life would be where choices were tested. But above all, she said one thing that netted them all: the boy was tied by some unspoken bond to both glory and ruin. Achilles, when he heard the words, paced until his legs ached and then sat down in a sudden, exhausted defeat. How do you parent a child who has been given good news that carries teeth beneath it? The knot of protectiveness in Achilles' chest tightened into something more like a plan. He thought of hiding, of relocation, of forging alliances with men who could be trusted. The plans were elaborate until they became excuses for inertia. Enoch, on the other hand, took the oracle's words like a tool, not a sentence. He learned to weigh choices by their probable results, and in so doing he became more strategic than most young men whose fathers were heroes. He practiced restraint like a craft. People who see a boy calibrating choices think it either the sign of a wise elder or the seed of a colder heart. Enoch carried both impressions at once. In the meantime, skirmishes and smaller wars boiled in nearby regions. Bandits, minor princes eager for fame, and angry townsmen made life unsettled. Achilles, never a man to sit and watch the smaller violences flourish, organized patrols and trained youths. Enoch joined these patrols not out of hunting for glory, but because he felt that facing fear in practice diminished its power. He cleaned a spear like a musician cleans his instrument, with reverence and a precise rhythm. During one patrol, Enoch saved a child from a burning cart, an act that should have been purely heroic and uplifting. The boy rescued was an infant of a family that resented Achilles for reasons lost to the small vendettas of less important people. Gratitude and resentment mixed like oil and water, and the town's sentiment remained a messy stew. Some celebrated Enoch, others saw the rescue as an omen transmuted into a sign of power they did not control. A new rumor grew that Enoch's right heel bore a mark that would be his undoing, whether by blood or by accident. The story was ridiculous, but stories are often not logical. It was easier to picture Achilles' son falling by a heel than to imagine the slow erosion of his reputation. Men told the tale around fires, embellishing until Enoch became both more dangerous and pitiable than he was. In the telling, the town reasserted control over fear by shaping it into narrative. To Enoch, the rumors were petty wind. He accepted them as facts he could not change and prioritized the things he could. He read strategy and history and the hymns of gods not because they were fashionable, but because he wanted to understand the forces that made men behave as they did. He began to develop a blunt diplomacy, an ability to say truth in ways that people could accept rather than reject. Diplomacy is a form of war, he learned, where words are weapons and shields without the clatter of armor. But the gods have ways of making abstract lessons concrete. A minor god of trickery decided that the town, so busy smoothing the space around itself with rumor, deserved a lesson in humility. He set small traps, a bridge plank loosened, a horse spooked in a parade, a lamb suffocated in its pens by unseen hands. People looked for scapegoats and, finding none, frowned at each other. These little misfortunes were the gods' amusement and also a test of how slender the community's nerves were. Everything gathered toward a moment like the slow drawing of a bow. Enoch was 19 and both too young and too old, a man whose age sat oddly between childhood habits and adult decisions. His face had the hard angles of someone who had been taught by pain to be careful. People inclined to superstition liked to point out his manner as proof of prophecy, and to those inclined to reason it was irritation. He moved through both worlds with the patient demeanor of someone who had decided to outwait catastrophe. A funeral of a popular elder brought the town to a near standstill. It rained, which made everyone think of mourning as if nature had decided to be proper. In the throng at the edge of the grave, Enoch stood with his head bowed, not because he feared the gods, but because he respected the dead. A man in the crowd, a man whose life had been defined by petty cruelty and jealousy, pushed forward in a drunken attempt to provoke a scuffle. He struck Enoch's friend, and the fight that followed was small and savage. Enoch, who had been taught both the art of restraint and the skill of defense, moved in ways both precise and devastating. The fight ended with the jealous man on the ground, his arm broken, his dignity pulverized. The town split in opinion. Some saw unnecessary defense, others saw excessive force. But the man who had been hit died the following day of an infection that no one expected. The quiet way in which death followed the brawl made superstitious minds race like horses set free. After the funeral incident, the priests called for a purification rite. Fires were lit, incense smoked, and the town circled Enoch with solemn faces that tried to hold compassion. He attended the rituals not as an accused man, but as someone participating in the town's attempt to wash itself of guilt. He stood in the smoke and felt ice sewn to his back like small, insistent pins. Rituals have a way of moving blame around and leaving certain people oddly vacant. Achilles felt the pressure in a way that was almost physical, as if the air itself leaned against him. He began to imagine removing Enoch from the town for good. He thought of moving to the Isles, where his legend was less likely to travel, where they could live quietly and be forgotten. Achilles imagined fields and a life without the itch of rumor. But Thetis reminded him that stories have a way of catching up to silence, that avoiding fate is itself a kind of submission to it. Enoch, reading the shifting patterns of his own life, decided to leave before Achilles could force the choice. He thought of a pilgrimage, the old way of leaving one life for another, and of testing the edges of his nature against strangers who did not know his name. When he announced it one dawn, with a backpack slung over a shoulder and an expression like cracking ice, the town reacted with a sound somewhere between relief and regret. Achilles found that the anger to yell with had been replaced by a quiet ache. He left with a small company, a friend, a mercenary with a soft smile, and a young scribe eager for adventure. The sea took them in a wash of gulls and wind, and the shore slid away like an old painting. Travel changed Enoch slowly. He learned to read men by their gait and to hear lies in the way voices dip. Training became less formal and more survivalist. A life on the road teaches economy of motion and economy of trust. The first real test came when a lord in a coastal fortress demanded the right to levy taxes under threat of violence. His men beat a farmer and took his harvest, and people were too afraid to resist. Enoch saw the injustice and decided not to wait for someone else to fix it. He organized a small movement, a kind of guerrilla justice that recovered stored grain and returned it silently to hungry families. It was an act that blended bravery and recklessness in equal measure. Such acts, even done for the right reasons, set one on the path of being a problem. Lords notice justice as they notice their own reflection when someone has scratched it. The fortress lord sent a herald with a notice for Enoch to be brought forward for trial or exile. The herald's words were thinly veiled threats. Enoch responded not with flight but with planning, and his planning had something of Achilles in it, a directness that bordered on stubbornness. In one sly encounter, Enoch infiltrated the Lord's granary disguised as a laborer and left a message spelled out in grain, a childish prank that embarrassed the Lord but delighted the hungry. The prank escalated the conflict at a delicate pace, like a flicking of fingers across a tense string. The Lord was humiliated. He devised a plan to capture the strange youth who had made him the joke. Once more, Enoch found himself a figure the powerful could not ignore. When the trap was sprung, Enoch's company was ambushed in a narrow pass. They fought bravely, with an odd mixture of heroics and improvisation honed from months of living in the margins. Enoch saw friends fall, and he felt a familiar cold settle into his chest the way Achilles felt before a spear struck. He moved with a clarity that made battles simple geometry: calculate, act, and preserve. Yet for all his skill, there are times when fate insists on taking a hand. He lost his friend the mercenary that day, a man with a laugh like snapped rope and a face that had been tanned by too many suns. Slaughter was a teacher that taught in quick, ugly lessons. Enoch passed the test in ways that haunted him later. The loss deepened him, but it also hardened a determination not to be a passive object in the world. He resumed his travels alone, a darker figure with more weight to his stride. News of his deeds spread like an infected wound or a blessed rumor, depending on who told it. Words leapt between towns, carrying fragments until Enoch had a dozen different reputations. Some called him a hero, others a brigand, and still others a cursed child who brought misfortune in his wake. Names or whether, one seized them as they wished to. The multiplicity of identity began to bother Enoch less. He had learned that the self is a country where many dialects live. In a city of marble temples, he met a woman who was a scholar of old songs. She listened to Enoch's story with patient curiosity and then taught him an old poem of exile that children once sang to chasing the dawn. She did not see him as cursed, she simply catalogued his deeds as material for her notes. He loved her in a way that teased him from his loneliness, but love with Enoch was always half concession and half risk. He loved like a man who knows the sea is beautiful but treacherous. They stayed together for a season. She read to him by lamplight and taught him to translate old prophecies without panic. Their nights were quiet and their mornings deliberate. But the world will always test such maladies. A messenger came with a request for Enoch to return to his home about a matter of law. Achilles had petitioned for his son's return, perhaps out of fear or perhaps out of love. The scholar urged him to go, and he returned like a man walking back into a room where everyone had been waiting for him with knives hidden under their sleeves. His return was not triumphant. The village greeted him with a medley of suspicion and relief. Children ran to him with bright curiosity, elders frowned. Achilles met him at the dock with a look that was not criticism but ongoing grief. They talked in a quiet room while the sea pressed its ear to the window and listened. Father and son argued like two withered trees exchanging the wind. Both were steady in their stances and both were fragile in ways only the other could name. Just when Enoch thought he might embed himself into a life of measured peace, the gods intervened again, but this time more directly. A messenger from Olympus, in a guise both grand and clinical, arrived on a dawn of thick fog. She offered Enoch a choice: to take a sword handed down from ancient hands, the blade of a hero, and in taking it to accept a fate that would either crown him or consume him. Choices offered by gods feel less like choices and more like compacts. He took the blade because he was both curious and tempted. Such steel calls to those who know the cadence of battle. The moment his hand closed around the hilt, a tremor of recognition shivered through him, as if the world read the touch and registered it. Achilles saw this like an omen fulfilled, and his expression folded into something unreadable. The grip of the past tightened and the future sharpened. Enoch felt the weight of the blade as if it were a ledger of debts. Rumors of the weapon spread in quick succession, and it drew men who wished to test the steel and others who desired it for reasons that were darker. A usurper in a neighboring city coveted the blade for his own theater of vanity. He sent agents disguised as merchants and poets to flatter Enoch, to learn his habits and to stir resentments. Enoch, now more aware of how the world can be engineered against a man, saw through these petty machinations with a sadness that comes from being grown weary before one's time. The usurper's covert aggression eventually moved to a straightforward act. He declared Enoch an outlaw and posted a bounty for his capture. Men who think in coin will always change moral equations when money is involved. The bounty proved a magnet, attracting the sorts who live by knives and calculation. Enoch, who had amassed careful alliances and a small troop who respected him, prepared for a time that felt like the closing of a book. The final battle came at twilight, in a field scented with rosemary and mud. Enoch fought with his learned restraint and his instinctive ferocity, with the blade singing and the world narrowing to the geometry of life and death. He moved like a man who had studied many forms of strategy: strike, withdraw, deceive, protect. His men stood beside him as if they were part of a single living thing, and when Enoch shouted they answered like a chorus in a more ancient hymn. At the height of the conflict, a spear struck not at his throat but at his heel. The wound was like an echo of his father's story, a cruel mimicry that made the breath leave him in a violent, personal way. He fell with a sound like a closing book, the world flattened to the shape of the blade. His death was both tragic and inevitable in the town's narrative, the grim moral that had seemed to orbit his life finally claiming a form. Yet there was something else in that falling, a complexity that refused to be boiled down into neat lesson. As he lay dying, Enoch saw figures approaching that were neither kindly nor monstrous. The fates had moved and rearranged themselves. What he saw was not prophecy but a kind of odd mercy. He remembered the seer, Thetis' repeated whispers, the scholar's calm voice, the blades and the sun. Images sped past not in order but in a confusion that felt like the true last gift of life, to see everything that had been afforded and stolen. He died without curses on his tongue, only with admiration for the strange, not at things life had taught him. But stories are stubborn. The same townsfolk who loved him found a different pleasure in making his death into proof that their fears had been true. They called his end the fulfillment of curse, presented it as a warning, and wrote him down in the margin of their lives as an example. Others, a quieter number, refused this simple moral. They told a more complex tale, that a life can be brave and flawed, brilliant and doomed, and that grief is not always an emblem but a detail. Achilles received the news like a tidal injury. The father, who had navigated grief by casting himself into fury and then into absence, found himself stranded by a sorrow that was not a spear but a hollow. He built a tomb for Enoch with his own hands, an act that was less about the shape of stone and more about the confession of a father who had learned too late the price of storytelling. He sat there often, mouthing quiet apologies to a silence that does not forgive or answer. Thetis, who had feared for both sons in very different ways, stood at the shore and let salt water and tears mingle. She thought of fate and of her attempts to intervene. She thought of the small ways a mother's hand can fail to keep a child safe, of the gulf between intention and effect. Her grief matured into a kind of contrition that only an immortal might know, the endless folding of regret into the hours without the hope of closure. Enoch's death did not simplify the town's relationship with fate. It complicated it, as endings often do when they refuse to tidy everything neatly. Some began to question the old stories that had dictated so much of their behavior, while others doubled down, turning to stricter rituals and more severe omens. The historian in the city of Marble wrote a treatise arguing that Enoch's life was a study in the tragic effects of prophecies, while a poet in a small tavern wrote lines that tried to catch the messy brilliance of a brief life. When a story ends, not everyone agrees on what it means. Subscribe and tell us in the comments if you'd search for new answers or keep believing the stories that raised you. The scholar who had been Enoch's brief companion wrote to Achilles and to Thetis, attempting to stitch a different memorial with words. She spoke of courage and of the childish things he had loved, of the way he read and how he told her of a desire to change the world. Her letters, few and frank, came to be read aloud at small gatherings where people wanted to remember him in ways that were not about masks. Memory is a craft in itself, and her hands were steady. The blade he had taken did not vanish into myth immediately. It was put in a shrine for a time and then stolen by bandits who understood cultural currency. It passed through many hands, some violent and some ceremonial, each adding a layer to the story until the metal itself seemed thick with history. Items carry the weight of their bearers. This sword sang of both heroism and grief and eventually became itself an artifact of cautionary tale. Years passed, as years must. Children who were young when Enoch died grew into the adults who carried his legend in their speech. New stories braided into his memory, a ghost seen on storm nights, a voice calling across a cove, a shadow that would not lie flat in the grass. Such additions are the imagination's way of keeping sorrow alive. They both comfort and complicate. The town itself changed, as towns do, moving through cycles of quiet and of small frenzy. Achilles lived on, though the shape of his living altered like a river changing course. He continued to fight when needed, but less for the glory of men and more to keep his hands busy in a world that suddenly felt too fragile. He learned, in the most brutal of ways, that heroism and parenthood are not mutually exclusive, but that power often fails at domestic tasks. He spoke more carefully to children and occasionally taught them the odd truisms he had learned. Mercy is not weakness, restraint can be bravery, and love is a dangerous, splendid thing. Generations later, bards told the story differently depending on their audiences. In halls where men wanted courage to feel safe, Enoch's tale became a warning. In homes where mothers wanted permission to be tender without fear, his story became a hymn to small kindnesses. Myths change shape as people need them to, and Enoch bended into forms that made sense for the living. The cursed son label stuck in certain mouths, but was softened in others, like a dish seasoned to taste. The more thoughtful among the gods observed with the same ambiguous emotions humans had, interest folded into distance. Some gods, ashamed perhaps, decided to perform small, almost invisible kindnesses. A fisherman now finds a net full more often. A child who resembles Enoch in some small feature is saved in an unforeseen accident. These acts do not write a death, but they operate on another scale, the incremental correction that gods may occasionally offer when they are either remorseful or merely bored. As for Enoch's grave, it became a place where people left small tokens, a ribbon one winter, a shell the next, a scrap of cloth in a drought year. It was less a shrine now and more a living thing that gathered the attentions of those who could not let a young life simply be consumed by a cautionary moral. The stones around it remember names and small prayers, and the wind murmurs what it will. In time, even the moss that grew over the name bent to the passage of people who visited to remember not only a curse, but the boy who was also a son and a friend and a strange, bright human. The name Enoch entered odd corners of culture in ways no single person had planned. A song about a doomed hero used the cadence of his death to make crowds weep. A children's rhyme altered his image to soften parents' fears. Some called him cursed, others saint, and yet others simply used his story to talk about loss. Myth is not truth but a conversation over generations, and Enoch's life became a point of reference for the complicated talk humans must have about their children. Achilles never forgave himself entirely, nor did he require anyone's forgiveness. He performed small acts of kindness that were less for show and more for an internal economy of guilt. He taught younger men restraint and mourned for the boy who had taught him fatherhood in the most brutal ways possible. Occasionally, in the absence of a full singing, a bard would raise a quiet song about a father and son, and the gathered listeners would stare at their cups and think of their own unmade apologies. Time, that steady eroder of myths and of men, softened some edges and sharpened others. The memory of Enoch matured into something that resembled both exemplum and elegy. People who had been children during his life told the stories to their grandchildren with a tenderness that softened the edges of rumor. The town kept both faces in its collective heart, the face of the boy who had loved quietly and the face of the idea that great things come with great cost. There is a final, small consolation in all tales, the knowledge that sorrow changes people in ways that sometimes make the world better. Enoch, in his short life, had become a teacher of sorts without meaning to. He taught that courage is messy and that curses are often invented to explain the terror of randomness. People learned to be gentler with the children they had, more patient in their fear, and more careful in the way they used story to justify cruelty. So the tale of Enoch remained stubbornly inconclusive, as lives often are. It resists a single moral and refuses to be a tidy warning. Instead, it is a layered thing, a palimpsest of grief, courage, mistake, and kindness. When the wind blows across his grave, the grass moves and the sea answers with a long, patient note, as if the world is still deciding exactly what to call him. It is possible, in the end, that no label fits the complexity of a human life. Achievements and curses, heroism and missteps, sorrow and joy mingle in a person like colors in a river, not pure and not solid. Enoch's story persuades us of this ambiguity, and perhaps that is the only thing that matters, to accept that some lives cannot be reduced to cautionary tales or heroic archetypes. They are, instead, small constellations of moments that shine briefly and then pass into a sea of memory. Long after the scent of smoke faded from the fields where men once rose and fell like wheat, the stories that remained were not about victories or treaties, but about the wounds that refused to heal. Achilles lay at the heart of one of those wounds, a name spoken soft as prayer or curse depending on who remembered. His fame was a river that ran through many nations, carving images into stone and song. Yet there were currents beneath it, currents that tugged toward places where history blurred with rumor and rumors slid into old, patient darkness that even gods avoided naming aloud. They called him by many epithets across languages and caravans, but Achilles himself had been less a man than a force, a geometry of grief and rage shaped by a single, unyielding heel. He moved through battles like weather, inevitable and catastrophic, and his body became a map for those who would follow him into memory. Soldiers painted his likeness on shields so they might walk with his shadow into slaughter. Children learned of him as a final lesson in limits and destiny, a mirror reflecting both bravery and the cost of being more than human. Enoch watched the river of Achilles' fame from a distance other listeners could not reach. He had been called many things in his own right: scribe, wanderer, watcher. He kept records not out of vanity but out of a duty older than any city, a charge to observe and to note the subtle movements where the divine brushed against mortal error. When the gods argued, he catalogued; when monsters shifted their sleep, he wrote down the seams. But there were certain sagas that demanded participation, and Achilles' path curved toward one such intersection. Their meeting did not happen on a battlefield strewn with broken standards. It happened in a margin, in the twilight where the world thinned and the gods themselves felt conspicuous. A liminal plain that smelled of salt and pine, where the moon hung like a coin someone had misplaced. Achilles arrived with armor clinking softly, as if each step counted a debt. Enoch was already there, a small figure holding a scroll, looking like an ordinary man until you realized the ordinary are the last suspects for the extraordinary. Enoch did not ask for permission. He did not kneel. He had stood before entities that could unmake sentences and believed humility was a gesture that belonged to those who had nothing else. He offered instead an accounting of debts, a list of names the world would not remember unless someone inscribed them. Achilles accepted the list as though it were another challenge. He read it, and his face, which usually held a single weathered expression, softened into something like curiosity. They spoke in that place of things not often spoken aloud. Of the wars that had no great banners or poet laureates, battles fought in narrow valleys of the mind or beneath cities where roots tangled with bones. Achilles had fought countless men and some who had been called gods by those who mistook power for divinity. Enoch told him of wars that had been erased, not by time, but by choice, conflicts the cosmic order preferred no one to catalog because their aftermath would complicate the ledger of balance. The forgotten wars, Enoch called them with a tone that implied a ledger and a lament. These were skirmishes between creatures that wore neither armor nor robes, but rather the dim personalities of dawn and the bitter last light of dusk. They were wars fought in the spaces where language failed, where metaphor slipped into reality and back. Achilles listened with a warrior's attention, as though each forgotten name might reveal the shape of his own undoing. Enoch's scroll unfurled like a map of dust itself. Names appeared that no crown remembered: the night architect, a thing that stitched nightmares into cathedral domes; the bone harvester, who collected skeletons to fashion new landscapes out of old defeats; whisper creatures that sowed doubt into the mouths of kings. Each entry was a tiny act of violence justified by survival, and each had its own logic that humans rarely glimpsed. Achilles found himself fascinated because these were not foes to outshine in single combat. They required a different kind of courage, a willingness to step into moral gray where swordplay offered no answer. What surprised Achilles most was how often mortals had been the answer. Men and women whose economies were thin and whose nights were restless had held back the tide of certain horrors, not with spear and shield, but with stubborn habits, prayers, and small acts of remembrance. Enoch showed his hand, and Achilles saw a ledger full of unpaid promises made to children, to farmers, to thieves who had once been kings. The idea of memory as defense transformed the hero's understanding of what it meant to fight. They traveled together in the days that followed, not through roads or cities, but across thresholds of perception. Enoch taught Achilles the names that blurred at the edge of language, the precise way to call to something without inviting it to hold you. Achilles, in turn, taught Enoch the blunt eloquence of battle, how to aim, how to accept a wound, how to move when the world demanded that motion. They became a strange pair, a scribe and a warrior, two methods of being stubborn aligned against a world that preferred forgetting because forgetfulness simplified governance. Enoch revealed a chapter in which Achilles had been mistaken by a god who mistook curiosity for defiance. This god, lacquered in sunlight and ceremony, had sent a host of small monsters, too clever for mere beasts and too stupid for strategy, to test Achilles' nature. The monsters pried and probed like children finding joy in fragile things. Achilles learned to walk among them with a patience that was not his natural costume. He realized that some monsters were not opponents to be slain but riddles to be solved. Once they encountered a swamp that remembered battles. This was no ordinary mire but a place where spilled blood became a mirror and names of the dead rose like water weeds. Achilles and Enoch walked through it, and the swamp answered them with echoes, the cries of soldiers, the lullabies of mothers, oaths whispered and minutes later broken. Achilles felt each echo as a pressure along his ribs, as if his mythic body held so many stories it needed breathing accommodations. Enoch recorded each echo with a priest's intimacy, his pen scratching like a tiny heart. The swamp remembered Achilles' own bloodiest moments, not as triumphs but as debts. Every friend he had lost returned as a question about justice. Did his rage repay them, honor them, or merely prolong their narratives into cycles of violence? Achilles, who had always been proficient in the logic of strike and counterstrike, found this arithmetic less satisfying. He had no manual for the debt his fame incurred upon others, and Enoch added that observation to the scroll with a dry stroke. They met a monster that wore the faces of cities. It was not malevolent in a simple sense. It had been built by collective anxiety and a desire for protection. The creature took on the architecture of defense. Arched windows became eyes, battlements shifted into teeth. It inhaled the lights of the populace and exhaled policies. Achilles attempted to approach it as if within reach, to cut away a limb and reveal whatever core kept it moving. Enoch whispered that some constructs maintained themselves by gossip and forgetting and could not be killed by force alone. At times the gods took an interest in their journey. Some appeared as curious arbiters, great figures who spoke in law and meteorology, while others watched as if watching a particularly entertaining clockwork. Enoch had learned that the divine often mirrored human bureaucracy. They organized grief into categories and assigned penalties for transgression. Achilles, who had always responded best to direct action, found himself in a particular disdain for such measured administration. He preferred the immediate and the tangible, a throat to strike, a shield to break, a promise to fulfill. Yet even the gods had their own terrors. Enoch revealed a pantheon of minor deities who had become monstrous through neglect. Abandoned altars accumulated resentment and became entities that specialized in petty cruelties. The god of spare coins punished generosity by making it disappear. The goddess of harvest grudgingly turned fields to salt when unthanked. They were not titans nor giants, but corrosive and patient underminers. Achilles learned that humility could be weaponized into oblivion if it was not also tended. There was a night where they encountered the Remembrancer, an emissary of a deity who cataloged sacrifices and labors. The Remembrancer danced along memory lines, collecting neat bundles of service and erasing the unsightly edges. Achilles watched this figure and felt a dangerous kind of envy. To be remembered was to be shielded from many minor violences. To be erased was to become food for the smaller, stranger predators. Enoch explained that memory had become a currency the gods could tax, and this notion made Achilles furious in a way that translated immediately into action. They came upon a valley of statues, each carved from the bones of unremembered heroes. The statues wore expressions that seemed to plead or scorn, sometimes both. Achilles felt kinship there, but he also felt dizzy from the implication that remembrance was manufactured. A hero could be placed on a plinth and given a story that eroded truth into tidy moral fragments. Enoch told him that the most dangerous monsters were those that sanitized and simplified complex sorrow into marketable virtue. Some monsters were made of language, cunning assemblies of words that misled whole populations. One such creature had learned to masquerade as prophecy, weaving sentences that made despair sound inevitable and thus acceptable. It spread like rumor, changing behavior without ever being seen. Achilles and Enoch found themselves engaged in a war of correction, not through blade but through clarity. Achilles' bluntness cut through the webs of suggestion, while Enoch's records reclaimed the dispirited facts. Together they found a rhythm, one to scatter the fog, the other to name what remained. Along the way they encountered those who had survived encounters with forgotten wars and now carried scars as geography. A woman in a coastal village bore a hand that remembered heat differently than the rest of her body. A boy in the mountains had nightmares that bled daylight into stone. An old man could not speak names but hummed them like bones. Their survival was not heroic in the way ballads described. It was mundane and raw. Achilles felt ashamed of plays and poems that painted his exploits in gold when real lives bore the aftermath as punctuation marks. Enoch taught Achilles how to listen to silence as if it were a language. Silence had syntax, the pause after a child's footstep, the hesitation before a confession, the void left when a town stopped telling stories about a person. In those silences monsters proliferated, not with grand gestures but through absence. Achilles learned that sometimes the hardest fight was to make a silence uncomfortable again, to force remembrance back into mouths that had gone mute. They learned how societies negotiated amnesia. Some cultures institutionalized forgetting as a bomb. They appointed days to unburden memory and encouraged citizens to lay down grief like a bezoar. Others ritualized memory with such fervor that it calcified into dogma, which then protected some and punished others. Achilles watched these systems and felt the old grappling truth: structure could save or constrict, and heroism had to be ethical as well as effective if it intended to matter beyond spectacle. An ancient river god rose when they crossed a bridge that had long since been a mere rumor on maps. He demanded recompense for the debts of drowned promises, bridges left unpaid, vows forgotten when floods swept through. The god was not merciless, he was procedural. To him, the universe preferred accounts to cruelty. Achilles, accustomed to settling disputes with steel, found this approach exasperatingly neat. Enoch negotiated with the god through the language the deity respected: inventory and witness. In one episode, they walked into a city of clocks, where timekeepers had been corrupted by a creature that loved to quarter lives into tiny, unremarkable measures. People that lived efficient lives, excellent at producing and consuming but poor at feeling. The creature fed on routine and had grown fat from public indifference. Achilles tore down a few of the creature's pedestals and found that the resulting chaos birthed feeling: rage, grief, relief, a messy human gradient that the creature had starved for decades. Enoch recorded the change with the tenderness of someone who had watched the landscape breathe again. There were fights that defied combat logic. A monster that thrived on apology turned reconciliation into a snare, accepting contrition as a meal and demanding more in a compounding interest of shame. Achilles tried to slash it to ribbons and found his sword merely made it hungry. Enoch suggested truth-telling as a weapon, a willingness to name complicity and accept imperfect restitution. In those moments, Achilles' concept of heroism bent toward repair rather than annihilation. The gods, watching from their peerages of cloud and ceremony, began to take bets on their progress. Some deities cheered them on, intrigued by the experiment of a mortalized hero partnered with a citizen of indefinite chronology. Others grew huffily annoyed that an ancient record keeper might rewrite divine categories with his pen. Enoch's impartiality sometimes seemed to offend gods who liked to assume their minutiae went unrecorded. Achilles enjoyed the god's discomfort because it felt like a victory unobtainable on a battlefield, the discomfiture of someone slick with certainty. At the city's edges they found a monstrous consortium that trafficked in forgotten names. It traded them like spices, offering snippets of identity to those willing to barter time, labor, or affection. A name called out from a cage and the air shifted as if a person might return to the world for a moment. Achilles had no patience for commerce in souls, and he smashed several cages. Enoch, however, noticed the price tags and the ledgers, and he was interested less in the theatrics than in the economics. His curiosity led them to a ledger where the consortium had listed contracts and collateral, an administrative horror that made Achilles' rage look like a child's tantrum. In a quieter valley they stumbled upon an agreement between two old monsters. Memory and Oblivion had once struck a bargain to keep the cosmos tidy. Together they agreed to tidy every story into categories that would make sense on census forms. But the bargain had been imperfect. Some stories were too knotted to be neat, and in those gaps sprouted new beings who feasted on the remainder. Achilles and Enoch considered whether bureaucracy itself had birthed monsters by insisting on tidy ends. The very act of cataloging could create exclusions, and exclusions created predators. Enoch had his own ghosts. He would sometimes unfold his scroll and trace a mark with a finger that left no ink but shimmered like a recalled melody. These marks were names of those he had failed to save from erasure. For every ledger line that produced understanding, there was one he could not fix. Achilles listened to the way Enoch spoke of failure and felt an unexpected kinship. The hero's victories had always been measured by the bodies left standing, but Enoch's scale measured a different axis, the fabric of continuity that linked one generation to another. Somewhere in the north they encountered a creature of frost that specialized in erasing the warmth out of histories. It moved like a breath across amber, coaxing smiles into statues. Achilles found this particularly cruel because it struck at the core of human resilience. Memory is warmth in cold times. Enoch taught Achilles to carry small fires of remembrance, rituals, and songs that people could keep under their tongues. These fires were not literal flames, but acts of communal recall, things passed hand to hand so a monster of ice could not snuff everything at once. They came upon a battlefield left for gods to rehearse on, a place of chalked lines and waxed arrows where deities exercised cruelty as sport. The gods here bet on mortal behavior and graded scenes on a rubric of suffering. Achilles watched in disgust as mortals were used like inkblots to see what the divine mind would imagine. Enoch recorded the exhibitions in a ledger that he then smuggled into the folds of mountains where no god would look. Some records must be hidden to matter. An orphaned town remembered Achilles differently than scholars. They told a tale not of a flawless, shining man but of someone who sat with them and listened as much as he spoke. He mended tools and taught farmers how to sharpen plow blades. It was the small, domestic acts etched into ordinary life that surprised Achilles more than any battle. These were the moments where a hero's legend could do good or harm depending on how it was remembered. Enoch noted that memory favored scandal and spectacle, and that often displaced ordinary kindness into obscurity. There were jealous gods, petty deities who thrived on the notion that heroes should be grand and aloof, untouchable and polished. These gods chaffed when Achilles knelt to help a child or when he listened to an old woman recite a dance. They preferred their champions to be statues that could not soil themselves with empathy. Achilles began to understand that his companionship with Enoch was anathema to that creed. He didn't mind the gods' displeasure. Where gods expected trophies, Achilles gave presents. They discovered a monster whose hunger had been cultivated by silence between generations. It grew fat in families that failed to pass down names and stories. Children in those houses learned to treat absence as natural and found themselves occupying spaces designed for grief. Achilles took to quietly opening doors where the monster nested and speaking aloud histories that had been waiting for voices. Enoch logged each recitation like a small census of victory, and the monster diminished as the voices rose. Sometimes their victories were Pyrrhic. In a coastal hamlet they saved the people from a storm that fed on lamentation, but in doing so they revealed truths that tore the town apart. Secrets spilled into streets, marriages broke, alliances shifted. Achilles wondered if the act of saving had stripped the town of its plausible lies. Enoch scribbled in the margins that truth often demanded a kind of reconfiguration that the human heart resented. There was no simple moral calculus in these salvations. The more they traveled, the more Achilles' legend shifted in Enoch's hands. The scribe was not merely recording facts, he was rearranging a narrative ethic. He chose which names to amplify and which gaps to leave raw. Achilles began to trust Enoch's taste because it softened the edges of his own fame. Fame, Achilles realized, was an instrument. Wielded well it could heal, wielded poorly it could raise. Enoch's steady hand taught him the difference between spectacle and stewardship. They met a child who remembered the name of a minor goddess no scholar had recorded. The child said the name between bites of bread as if she were practicing a new word. The goddess, thin from neglect, perked up like an old lamp when named and began to weave riddles around the child's dreams. Achilles watched this micro-ritual and felt the enormity of small acts. Naming, he learned, was a daily weapon against oblivion. Enoch marked the event with delight that was nearly imperceptible. At a certain point a pattern emerged. monsters proliferated where silence, bureaucracy, and indifference intersected. Achilles and Enoch became adept at identifying fault lines where memory might leak away. They devised methods that were not heroic in the conventional sense: communal dinners where stories were swapped, public archives written in songs, simple laments taught in schools. These were mundane instruments, but they proved surprisingly effective. Monsters that fed on neglect found themselves starved when neighbors began to speak consistently. The gods responded with varying degrees of annoyance and curiosity. Some offered Achilles gifts wrapped in riddles: a spear that never dulled but had to be used only for peeling fruit, a helmet that revealed the truth but would make the wearer forget their own name. Achilles mostly declined these gifts. He preferred the blunt truth to gilded constraint. Enoch warned him that even gifts were tests, and they accepted only what allowed them freedom to act, not what bound them to some divine narrative. The war that had once been forgotten returned in fragments. Like a comet, it left traces in rivers, names in stone, and small genetic quirks in certain populations that whispered of old experiments. Achilles and Enoch followed these traces like a couple of detectives. They discovered that the initial conflict had not ended so much as been rerouted into institutions and customs that muddled responsibility. Their job was not simply to defeat an enemy but to unspool how culpability had been dislocated into habit. In the end, their battles were as likely to be won at a kitchen table as on any field. A mother taught her child the name of a river that had been dammed, and the child made a game of it. The river's spirit stirred and demanded reparation. A choir of miners began to sing songs about the mountain's long hurt, and the mountain listened, slackening its appetite for men. Achilles started to understand that heroism could be soft and patient, that it could be about tending and listening as much as force. Enoch's ledger swelled with entries that looked less like tallies and more like hymnals. He began to write rules for remembering, practical rituals that any village could adopt. They were not heavy-handed ordinances but suggestions: keep a list of names by the hearth, teach a child's name alongside a neighbor's, sing the names of the lost on certain nights. These acts seemed small, and yet they rewired the relationship between person and past. The monsters that had feasted for centuries found fewer places to hide. As they wandered, Achilles found peace in strange shapes. He learned to set aside time for being a listener, and in return he gained a steadier understanding of himself. Enoch, who had once believed his duty was to observe, discovered that involvement did not necessarily corrupt his impartiality, it could deepen his accuracy. Together they became a reciprocal system: the scribe wrote the hero, and the hero embodied the scribe's understanding. They never fully erased the forgotten wars, for erasure assumes a finality the world rarely offers. But they changed the conditions that allowed such wars to be forgotten. They seeded communities with practices of remembering and rewriting, and they taught the gods that memory is not merely a tool for song but a field of political labor. Achilles left fewer corpses in the ledger of history and left more people with the practical tools to keep monsters at bay. When their journey slowed and the scrolls grew heavy with names, Enoch closed his writing and offered Achilles a last observation: that the truest well-being of a people was not measured by the number of battles won but by the number of stories passed between tables. Achilles, once convinced only by the clanging of arms, nodded as if a new doctrine had settled inside him. He had learned that a hero's finest victories were those that allowed others to keep their names. In a final twilight they returned to the liminal plane where they had first met, carrying mementos of 1,000 small salvations, a child's song, a village ledger, a broken spear transformed into a plow. The gods looked on, some with approval and others with the thin smile of those who love contests. Enoch rolled up his scroll and placed a small mark that signified something like contentment. Achilles felt the old hunger recede. His rage had been transmuted into the craft of repair. They parted with no dramatic ceremony because neither of them cared for dramatics anymore. Achilles walked alone toward the horizon, not as a figure who sought renown, but as a man who understood that being remembered often required steady, unheroic work. Enoch folded his scroll into the cleft of a mountain and whispered a name so it would not be lost. The mountain answered with an echo that sounded suspiciously like laughter. The years that followed were not legendary in the way songs demand. Communities kept traditions that stitched them together when storms came. Monsters still prowled, as monsters always would, fed by new forms of indifference and by old habits recirculated. Yet the world shifted subtly. Where silence once reigned, there were now rooms with names on the walls and songs passed between hands. Achilles' old wars lingered, but they no longer defined the human project. If you travel today and pass a kitchen where a grandmother insists on telling you about a distant uncle with a flaw and a joke, know that you have walked into the kind of resistance Achilles and Enoch championed. If you sit in a hall where a small plaque lists workers who died in a flood, that is a battlement against monsters of disappearance. Theirs is not a tidy legacy, it is a practice that hums along the margins of ordinary life. And sometimes, on a quiet night, if you look toward the rim of your town where the lamplight thins and the stars begin to meddle, you might imagine a warrior walking the path with a scribe at his side. They do not demand monuments. They ask only that you remember a name when you chance upon it, that you tell a child's story even if the final line lacks a dramatic flourish. In those acts, small and human, Achilles' wars are no longer forgotten, and Enoch's ledger keeps swelling with the ordinary courage of people who choose to remember. The night Enoch first stood beneath the carved pillars of Thia, the air tasted of iron and salt, like the mouth of a storm. He had come from a mountain clan whose fires burned low and whose children still whispered of old bargains. In the market he moved unnoticed, a man wrapped in a gray wool skirt, carrying nothing but a leather satchel and a stubborn hope. He was not a soldier, not yet. He was a heart tuned to listen for the small, honest rhythms of the world before the loud, lawless clamor of war took them captive. Achilles sat by the sea with armor set aside and bronze cheerfully dulling in the dusk. He watched the horizon as if there were some calculus in the waves that could be solved with a single look. When he smiled, it was brief and private, like a coin glance that then tucked away. He had been raised on song and spear, taught that the measure of a man was the arc his name carved into time, and yet there were hours when that same measure felt like a trap. Their meeting might have been a story of chance if stories could be trusted. Enoch crossed the beach at a time when Achilles was finishing a solitary meal, and their eyes found reasons to not turn away. Achilles studied the stranger with the interest of a man who had seen kings and prophets and wished to know which of them the newcomer most resembled. Enoch met him plainly, and in his hand lay a small object wrapped in oilcloth, a relic from a past not spoken of aloud. The relic unwrapped revealed a simple bone pipe carved with the sigils of a lineage that time had refused to forget. It smelled faintly of laurel resin and old blood, scents that made Achilles uneasy in a way he could not admit. Enoch spoke of vows made in hidden groves, of pacts sealed under oaths older than the names of Olympus. He told of a promise that had been broken and of a need to bind the being of Olympus by a pledge from a mortal hand. There is a particular gravity when a man offers his blood as argument. Enoch rolled the sleeve of his tunic and showed a narrow white line along his forearm, a scar from an old ritual. Achilles recognized that line as language. After other battles he had seen men mark themselves to remember their bargains. Blood history was a blunt, honest tongue. It left nothing out by accident. Enoch's voice when he spoke of the gods was not reverent, it was careful. He had listened to the creak and cough of the world and concluded that Olympus had grown careless. Gods held sway with beauty and decree, but the mortals who bent had begun to bend deeper than loyalty asked. Enoch wanted to correct the scale, to tilt it a fraction back toward the living earth. Achilles listened and thought of his mother, Thetis, who had dipped him in river foam and shaped the fierce geometry of his limbs. He remembered the ways the gods had honored his rage and polished it into legend. Yet he also remembered the faces of those who had died at his spear, and how the songs that praised him sometimes felt like chains. Enoch's talk of binding gods to mortal promises touched a place in Achilles that was both daring and soft. They journeyed inland, two shadows beneath a silvered moon, passing through fields still heavy with harvest scent. Villagers watched them with a mixture of curiosity and concealed fear. When a god's name is spoken too often, people forget how to mute their wishes. Enoch told not only of the pact but of the mechanics by which a god might be persuaded. He spoke of symbols carved in salt, of fires kept pure, of the old compounds that made celestial oaths drinkable like wine. Achilles had seen rituals, seen blood offered at marble altars and lips-moving syllables carried from ivory mouths. But Enoch's instructions were humble and terrifying. They required a vulnerability that armies never gave, the placing of one's personal name into a covenant where divine memory would be forced to honor human truth. Achilles felt the hinges of his life shift under that suggestion. They made camp beside an olive grove where the trees held the sun like small, slow hearts. Enoch produced the instruments of the oath, a cup rimmed with beaten bronze, a blade honed finer than common steel, and a strip of cloth dyed in indigo as deep as a boy's first grief. He explained the words to be spoken, each syllable measured and chosen so the gods would find them tight and undeniable. Achilles repeated them without mockery because he believed that if language could bind, it was worth the attempt. The night the oath was sworn, a wind rose that seemed to know the names of all the dead. They sat shoulder to shoulder with a small fire between them, and Achilles felt the weight of the choice press like a hand on his chest. Enoch scraped his palm and let the blood bead, then asked Achilles to do the same. Achilles did not hesitate. For him the spilling was not theater but offering, a line to cross between being fleet and being bound. They mixed the blood in the bronze cup and drank, and Achilles tasted iron and winter leaves. The moment the liquid moved down his throat, something ancient in the air shifted like the turning of a page. Enoch pronounced the vow in a language older than city walls, one that called forth witnesses from liminal places, river stones, cypress roots, and the hollow bones of long-dead oarsmen. For a heartbeat the world seemed to lean in to listen. Word reached Olympus in a manner that gods are wont to experience, not by messenger but by an ache in the bone. Zeus's thunder was a ripple in cloud, a small annoyance at first. Athena felt a cold draft where strategy usually warmed her and frowned as if at a book left open to an ugly page. The gods, who had learned to expect the predictable cycles of worship and supplication, registered this human act as an irregularity, something to be observed and corrected. Hephaestus, in his forge that hummed with the heartbeat of the earth, paused and set down his hammer. He was the god most pleased by crafted order, and he could not deny the artistry in a binding oath. Hephaestus could see the metal in the bronze cup and the skill in the word's arrangement, and for a moment he felt pride tinged with unease. Olympus did not like to be yoked. Its inhabitants preferred persuasion by beauty rather than constraint by promise. Hera regarded the vow with a queenly chill. Her own history with oaths was a tapestry threaded with jealousy and redress. She recognized in Enoch's design a challenge to authority. Hera's eyes, which had once locked husbands into fidelity and cities into favor, narrowed with the consideration of a woman who knows the cost of an insult. For the gods of Olympus, to be bound by a mortal contract was to be reminded that their power could be framed as law rather than whim. Not all the gods disapproved. Apollo, with his long, sharpened curiosity, found in Enoch's audacity a strange compliment to the music he loved. There was an art to restricting a will, Apollo thought, and beneath the morality of the act lay a pattern worth exploring. Artemis, fiercely private and protective of thresholds, understood Enoch's desire to limit harm, to give mortals a reprieve when divine caprice became too much. These nuances made Olympus a place of fractured opinions rather than a single, united front. News of the oath moved fast through towns and army camps alike, whispered from wineglass to spear point, growing in scale the way rumor does when fed by fear and longing. Soldiers wanted to laugh at the idea that a mortal might chain a god to an oath. Priests worried that the sanctity of worship would be diluted. Yet among mothers and seamstresses there was a glimmer of possibility, a hope that promises might now be enforceable and that a god's favor would have to be earned, not simply assumed. The first consequence came slowly, as if the world had to practice being different before it could become different. A temple's roof did not cave as expected under a votive gesture. A storm did not rise merely because a king demanded it. Small things changed. Rain fell in needed measures instead of wrathful torrents. Fields that should have withered held their green. And with each small success the public eye grew heavier with questions, eager to see whether a human oath could hold against a capricious divinity. Achilles began to feel a new gravity to his steps. The oath made him less of a single shining spear in the wind and more of a ledger keeper for consequences. Men found themselves asking his opinion on treaties, on whether the gods would honor what had been laid out in bronze and blood. He had not sought rulership, but the responsibility nested around him like a cloak he had not anticipated and could not shed. Enoch, meanwhile, tasted the bittersweet of victory and the fatigue of one who had loosened an established pattern. He walked the countryside with an exhausted clarity, explaining the terms, calming the anxious, and reminding warlords of the fine print. He had not imagined that a simple binding would demote hubris so readily. Instead, he found that the gods, like tides, would test the new shore in ways both subtle and brutal. Olympus responded in ways that bore the hallmarks of a court-weighing insult. Athena proposed rules to adjust the terms. Hermes joked publicly and privately that laughter could soften any hard edge. Apollo and Artemis debated the merits in dueling sonnets. Hera, with the patience of an empire, whispered to Zeus that mortals who meddled with divine prerogative had to be reminded of scale. Zeus, who loved balance like a shepherd loved his flock, weighed the options like one weighing oaths against appetite. A test came when a coastal lord demanded that Poseidon bend a storm to his will and forcibly take a harbor city. The lord's arrogance was a blade aimed toward the fragile peace Enoch had stirred up. Poseidon, roused by the insult to his marine dominion, sent a swell that gnawed at the harbor's docks with teeth of black water. The people ran and prayed and trusted that the blood oath might give them a defense they had lacked before. Enoch called Achilles, and together they stood on the cliff while breakers took the shore, the world at its wildest and rawest. Enoch intoned the terms of the oath and said a second, smaller ritual that localized the binding. Achilles stepped into the water, not like a hero seeking glory but like a man keeping an account. He waded through the surf and struck the sea with a spear and, in doing so, asked Poseidon's consent to be guided by the oath's reasoning. Poseidon, who had always moved like a thought and muscle, hesitated. Gods prefer the clarity of worship and the predictability of ritual. To be bound by human law requires a humility that could be resisted or purchased. Poseidon felt the tug of the bronze cup's words and, in a voice like shifting shingle, asked what a human name could expect to ask of a god. Achilles answered with no flourish, protection for the people, the moderation of tempests, and nothing more. The ocean rolled back as if to reconsider, and then it obeyed. The waves retreated, the harbor endured, and the coastal town breathed like someone learning to be forgiven. For those who had believed in the sanctity of promises, the event was a miracle. For others it was an irritation, a boundary that had become inconvenient to overstep. But for Achilles and Enoch, it was a verification that blood and bronze could confine not just men but gods. Soon the complications multiplied. The gods were not monolithic, they worked by personality and grievance. Some obeyed because to disobey would render them into a novelty rather than a power. Others resisted by proxy, by lending their favor to kings who would violate the oath and then claim divine backup. It became a dance of loopholes and legalities, of clever men and women finding sentences to exploit, of priests trying to translate the oath to their advantage. Enoch learned that law made of blood must be defended like a border. He found himself drafting clauses, traveling to obscure shrines to stitch them tighter, and cajoling reluctant city magistrates to keep their end. He did not enjoy the role of legislator, but the world is often less shaped by those who wish to rule and more by those who wish to stop certain things from happening. He wanted to stop God-driven caprice, and he would not stop until the architecture of worship itself bent toward restraint. Achilles felt the strain in a different way. The oath had made him a symbol for many things he did not intend to symbolize. Mortals asked him to enforce justice, while leaders demanded he commit to wars that might be simpler if gods were not bound. He faced appeals from orphans and entreaties from generals, each expecting him to be both spear and scale. His days became a ledger of choices in which every victory had its cost and every kindness risked entangling him further in politics. The gods watched these developments with their distinct blend of envy and amusement. Some entertained themselves by setting snares for the oath, watching as men built elaborate traps from language. Others took a more philosophical approach, wondering if binding might ultimately ennoble them by teaching restraint. The small gods of hearth and field, once neglected, found their voices rising as mortals sought safe guarantees. Even Hestia, quiet in her hearth, smiled at the thought of boundaries that spared lives. An incident in a mountain valley made everything more urgent. A warlord who had been denied a certain pride sought to buy a god's favor with an offering of slaughter. He thought he could bribe Ares with blood and thereby nullify any oath that a human might enforce. The plan was cruel in its cleverness. Achilles intercepted the warlord's caravan, not solely with a blade but with a reading of the oath's clauses, and the man found himself shamed before other chieftains. Shame has the power of a quiet blade. The warlord found his reputation dissolving, and with it his pool of men. He could not rally his usual force because men would not march for a leader who could be so publicly outmaneuvered. The oath had, in a sense, weaponized honor against tyranny. It asked cities and clans to police themselves with the same fierce fidelity that once made them worshipful and made them ferocious. Achilles began to understand that being the living ledger meant daily negotiations with both flesh and myth. He mediated disputes about dowries and settled grievances that had nothing to do with spear points. People sought his counsel when a harvest went missing or when a father demanded blood for a small insult. His hands, which had been trained to fight, became hands that signed documents and tightened knots. Enoch grew wearier. His dreams were crowded with the faces of gods and mortals entwined. He had thought that once the oath was made the world would find equilibrium. Instead, equilibrium demanded constant tending. He traveled to Delphi and listened to the seers who braided prophecy with caution. He learned that prophecy could be a net as much as a map and that binding a god to promise did not remove the need for interpretation and foresight. Olympus grew fractious. Zeus worried that the web of human law might metastasize into a system where gods were mere administrators of will rather than creators of caprice. He convened a council and, with that imperial tone, attempted to recalibrate how gods and mortals might interact. Some gods wanted to punish the transgressors who had dared to make oaths, others suggested concessions and accommodations. The debate was long and smelled of incense and competitive memory. In the meantime, a new kind of theologian emerged among cities and islands. These men and women studied the oath as if it were scripture, tracing its edges, testing its durability. They were not all faithful, some were seeking advantage, others a genuine reform. Their work gave rise to treatises and songs and even plays where characters debated the limits of divine duty and human right. Public conversation changed, the old unquestioning servility thinned into civic scrutiny. War flared now and again because human hands are not patient instruments of peace. When war came, it was colored by the new constraints. Kings who sought the gods' direct war did not always find them so obliging. They had to petition the oath's adjudicators or risk being parried in public opinion. This shift did not end bloodshed. It merely altered its choreography, forcing some to rewrite plans and rethink the calculus of conquest. Enoch took to teaching. He instructed a cadre of scribes and small judges in the language of binding, men and women who understood the gravity of holding gods accountable. They traveled across islands and frontiers and sat with communities, translating the oath into local practice. It was slow and tedious, full of small misinterpretations that had to be corrected with patience. The work was never ending the way a garden is never fully weeded, but it drew people into civic tasks that were their own. Achilles found new forms of praise. There were songs that no longer celebrated mere prowess but celebrated the measure of a man who could keep a promise. Poets composed lines about the stubbornness of promises and about the quiet heroism of choosing to bind a more powerful thing for the good of the many. Achilles, ever wary of being a monument, often preferred to sit with ordinary folk and hear their complaints, which felt truer to him than the marble laurels of fame. The gods, in many ways, adapted as all old systems must. Some withdrew into niches of myth, content to remain placeless vignettes in children's lessons. Others found subtle workarounds, influencing things through dreams rather than mandates, telling a hero in a whisper to act as if the wind itself had called him. This was a more patient, insidious method and one that tested the mettle of the oath. Words bound overt action, not the soft murmur of suggestion. Still, there were moments of real magic when the oath shone plain and clean. Villages that would have drowned found shelter in a promise. A hunter's curse was reversed because a god had been forced to remember a name. Enoch and Achilles saw people weep for joy at small mercies that once would have been too costly a request. These moments fed them in a way food could not. They felt the work had meaning beyond the immediate calculus of politics. Time, as it tends to do, softened edges. The initial fury and contest overheated into a new normal where humans were more inclined to consider the consequences of invoking a god as flippantly as one might consider the use of a blade. Oaths became a tool of law, a piece of the civic furniture, like a bridge or a tax. People argued over it in taverns and over hearths, and those arguments made the boundaries both broader and more detailed. A younger generation, born into a world where blood oaths had become plausible governance, took less measure of the gods in their life decisions. They were practical, inventive, and often skeptical. They used the oath to protect markets and assure trade routes. They used it to prevent the sabotage of irrigation works and to keep bandits honest. Their use was pragmatic and sometimes mercilessly efficient. Age called it progress, youth called it necessity. Enoch aged as men destined to change things age, quickly in spirit, slowly in body. He retired to a village by the river and tended a small garden, the work of soil and seed, an antidote to the politics he had once stoked. He would sit on evenings watching children who never had to beg for mercy from the gods. He liked to think his work had given them room to grow without being at the whim of marble-fisted divinity. Achilles never retired in the way people imagined. His name lived on in the whispered vows of soldiers and the more public ballots of magistrates. He continued to intervene, but his interventions were softer, more judicial than once they had been. He fought to keep the oath whole, to prevent its corruption, and to remind men that making promises they could not keep was a crime against both the present and the future. When Enoch finally passed, it was quiet and not at all heroic. He died in his sleep, his hands stained with earth rather than blood, and the village set a small stone to remember him. People traveled from far to leave trinkets or words and to tell how his oath had saved a neighbor or stopped a flood. They did not erect a grand temple. They placed a bench and a simple inscription that read like a proverb and invited discussion rather than obedience. The gods noticed the smallness of the memorial and smiled in various ways. Zeus made a faint rumble that sounded like approval. Athena sent a dove that perched briefly on the stone and then flew away. For all their celestial pomp, the gods could still appreciate the human rituals of remembrance, especially when those rituals were modest and honest. Years later, children would run by that bench and ask why their elders had once been so wary of Olympus. Their parents would tell them about Enoch and Achilles and the blood in a bronze cup, but they would also tell them about the cost of restraint. No promise is free, they would say, and binding a god is like binding a river, it can be done gently or not at all. Achilles outlived the oath's first fervor. He remained a witness to how fragile institutions were and how sturdy they could become with care. He grew less quick with anger and more patient with the slow legalities of keeping promises. In his later years, he taught young magistrates how to read the oath, how to keep it from being used to justify tyranny, and how to keep it from being ignored in times of need. The story of the blood oath traveled with merchants and sailors and in time settled into a broader myth that did not always recall the specifics but kept the spirit. Mortals had once dared to frame gods. The myth was retold with embellishments, as myths will do. Some versions made the drama leaner, more heroic, and others softened it into a cautionary tale. Yet within all these retellings was a steady core about accountability and the public good. One day, long after the first pact, a young woman stood at the same bench where Enoch had been remembered and read aloud the old inscription. She was unsure of many things but certain of one, that people deserved a chance to live their lives without the caprice of powers beyond them. She took up the bronze cup that had become a ceremonial relic and vowed in a small voice to keep the law alive. In that simple act, the story flickered and breathed anew. There were those who would argue until the end of days that God should never be bound by mortal syllables, and there were those who believed that humans should never put chains on beings whose nature was to be free. The argument supplies the energy of community much like friction supplies fire. Neither side was wholly right because the world is not built of absolutes but of negotiations held in cold light and in crowded rooms. Enoch's legacy was less about control than about the insistence that power answered to consequence. He had not set out to subjugate the divine. He had wanted only to make the lives of ordinary people less precarious. That insistence changed law, song, commerce, and, most of all, the conversation between the mortal and the immortal. It made a new kind of humility fashionable, the humility to accept that greatness must be accountable. Achilles, in time, became less of a lone spear and more of a man who could bear witness without being derailed. He taught that courage and restraint are often siblings, and that bravery without judgment can be a form of cruelty. He aged like a tree does when planted in a well-tended field, strong, useful, and sheltering. His name did not fade so much as deepen its meaning, and the young began to ask whether heroism might not include the protection of small lives. In the end, the world did not become perfect. God still had caprice and men their follies. But there were more places of refuge, more towns where a family could trust in a predictable season, and more occasions when a son could ask for work instead of war. Enoch's blood oath had bent one part of the universe toward restraint, and in so doing reminded the world that power, divine or mortal, bristles best when held within limits. The myth settled into the everyday and became, in its practical application, a kind of weather. It was sometimes stormy, sometimes fair, but people learned to read its signs. Priests found new languages to pray with, magistrates a new set of tools to adjudicate, and artists new themes to paint and sing about. The world, complicated and human, kept being asked by its inhabitants to do better, and sometimes it did. When you stand now by a harbor or sit beneath an olive tree and feel a tenderness for the living things around you, think of the small bowl of bronze and the road that two men walked together. Remember that vows are not only about keeping the strong from breaking the small, but about making the small ones strong enough to ask for justice. That is the legacy of Enoch and Achilles, a stubborn hope that the mortal heart can hold a god to account while keeping its own hands gentle. The story does not stop for neat moralization. Lives continue, laws evolve, and new challenges arise that demand fresh thinking. But the echo of that first blood oath hums like a string that was once tuned and now sustains new melodies. It reminds a world prone to grandeur that sometimes the most heroic acts are those that require careful speaking and consistent care. So when we speak of Achilles now, we do not only speak of the blade and the field. We speak of a man who stepped into something larger than his anger and who learned to keep a promise that affected millions. When we speak of Enoch, we speak of an architect of civic courage, a stubborn craftsman of law who understood that to bind a god is to claim a future where people are less at the mercy of caprice. Both names live because both took responsibility for what came after their choices. And so the sea keeps beating against the shores of a world changed by a small, fierce act. The bench by the river holds names, and the bronze cup rests in a case, kept for the day someone will again need to bind a power to protect the people. Until that day, the lesson remains that promises are a form of power, and that power, when bound with wisdom, can keep the world less cruel. That is the story of Achilles, of Enoch, and of an age when a mortal dared to defy Olympus and, in doing so, taught a lesson about stewardship that has endured beyond legend. Achilles stood at the lip of the world as if the sea itself were a threshold, wind clawing at the cloak that did not know the weight of immortality. He had long accepted the paradox of his own existence, the body of a man, the fate of a legend, eyes that saw too far into the brightness and too deep into the ruin. On that shore he waited for something that was not the simple deliverance of a hero, but a notice, a summons or a sentence, that would haul him from the neat pattern of song and into a straighter darkness. The summons arrived not as a trumpet but as a silence, wide and hungry, and in that silence Achilles heard a name older than most of the gods, Enoch. To anyone who knew the half-lore of the worlds, Enoch carried a reputation like a cloak, walked with God, taken into heaven, returned in fragments of story, a figure whose moving had bent the border between the mortal and the divine. Here, on the shore where the salt erased footsteps fast as breath, Enoch's descent was spoken of as exile rather than ascension, as a crossing that had been reversed and thus unmade the world they thought they knew. The first moment of Enoch's arrival was not spectacle so much as a rearrangement of sound and light. The gulls stopped, not because they obeyed a command, but because the air had been rewritten and their calls did not fit the new grammar. Achilles felt the short hairs along his forearms stiffen with the sense that history had altered its direction. Things that had been rehearsed many times by skalds and prophets alike now behaved as if they remembered a previous life and were trying, with clumsy tenderness, to do it again. Enoch did not come with trumpets nor with the naked glow that scribes later assigned to him when their hands trembled and their inks ran out. He came instead as a man with the lengthened shadow of a man, and as a book with its first page scorched. His eyes were at once weary and electric, eyes like someone who had watched doors for an impossibly long time and had finally learned to read the hinges. He wore neither crown nor shame, only a belt of knotted copper and a tunic that patinaed to the color of memory. Achilles recognized in Enoch that peculiar exhaustion borne by those who had survived time's hunger. It was not the tiredness of a body that had labored, it was older, the fatigue of perspective. Achilles had lived fast, loved badly, and killed with the efficiency of a man who had been told he was necessary. But Enoch seemed to have located a deeper inventory of being, a cartography of consequences and promises traced on his palms. They spoke without much prelude, as if the conversation had been waiting in the bones of both of them. "You should not have come," Achilles said, and his voice slid like river stones against the edges of things. "Neither should you," Enoch answered, and the remark was neither warning nor welcome but a record of agreement between travelers who had met once in a sequence of otherwise unsurprising deaths. Enoch explained then, in fragments that were both clear and maddening, that descent and ascent are not as simple as direction. There are levels to the cosmos, lattices of intent and obligation, places where the law of men holds and places where it is all but meaningless. He had been taken up and had seen the architecture of cause. He had descended because staying aloft was a kind of accusation, an unease against the mechanics of fate, and there was work yet to be done in the folds beneath the sky. Achilles listened, and with each sentence he felt the old certainties peel away. Glory, the bee-sweet scent that had always led him like a hound, began to taste of iron and ash. He had been taught to believe that his line was straight, live bright and die young, and carve your name into the marrow of memory. Enoch offered a different kind of ledger, one that tallied not only what was burned into stone but what lurked in the seams of time between the stones. The idea of exile was newly dressed for Achilles. He had known the exile of the battlefield, the long boring travel between camps and tempers, the exile of relationships that ended in graves. Exile beyond the mortal realm, however, required a different vocabulary. It meant leaving the cadence of dawns and market smells, stepping through architecture that had never been built by hands but woven by intent, and subscribing oneself to the slow work of undoing and remaking law. Enoch spoke of watchers and lines and the way the heavens sometimes frowned like an old woman scolding a child who has set the table wrong. He said there were custodians of balance, creatures who kept the ledger from overflowing, and sometimes those custodians erred. Those errors had consequences that bled down into the world of men as shadows, as storms, as judgments passed in the name of gods who had grown careless with their power. Achilles could feel the truth of this in the way a storm makes the hair on your neck rise. It was carburant for his rage, and yet it touched somewhere quieter where grief lived. Grief, for Achilles, had been translated into the names of dead men and the sameness of riverbeds that cut for hundreds of nights and days through foreign lands. Patroclus had been the sharpest blade through his chest, the loss whose echo still sang in his ribs as if some chorus had been torn out and yet refused to stop. Enoch did not remove the grief but reframed it. "There are alleys of mourning beyond what you have known," he said gently. "There are courts where the dead make the living reckon, and there are pages where sorrow writes its own laws." Achilles, who had once believed strength was the right answer to everything, found then that the muscles that had carried him across battlefields did not afford him the keys to this other city. In a way he was relieved. The simplicity of the spear, the clarity of a strike, had been a comfortable tyranny. To be asked to learn patience and endurance in a place that reorganized time was to be taught humility by something more indifferent than the gods he had been raised to fear. They crossed the shore not as conquerors but as fugitives from chronology. The sea, which had always marked an outer edge between the human and everything beyond, became a door that closed behind them with the soft decisiveness of a breath. The air they found on the other side tasted like metal and rain and the faint fault lines of prayers unfinished. There were no birds here, only a hush that seemed to catalogue each step with judicial care. Enoch moved with the sort of confidence that is either virtue or the stubborn habit of one who remembers too much. Achilles followed and felt, in his stride, the inrush of stories. He saw in Enoch's face mappings of names and places that were sometimes familiar, mountains that matched the silhouettes of his world, rivers that held echoes of waters he'd crossed, and sometimes entirely alien, a forest whose leaves whispered in a language that smelled of wind and currency. The world they entered had strata like cliffs composed of story. Each layer held a history of attempts, of prayers that had sought different shapes. Sometimes the layers bled into each other, and that was where nightmares grew, where a farmer's lament warped into the hymn of a forgotten god, where children's laughter fused with the clinking of chains. Enoch walked these places like a man accustomed to reading a map printed in a script everyone else misread as chaos. People they encountered along the way were not people as Achilles had expected. Some were former heroes naked of their crowds, their reputations like empty cups, sitting on stones and mending the seams of their own fabric. Others were like shade sculptors, shaping grief into tools and trading them for memory. No one stared at Achilles with the worship or fear he had long been accustomed to. Here, his deeds were not currency but weight, an object to be measured and then set aside. Enoch explained that punishment and exile were not the same. Punishment required a verdict and the satisfaction of a moral ledger being balanced. Exile, on the other hand, was a relocation of purpose, as if someone wrote you out of a book and placed you in another where your lines were rewritten each day. Achilles could see its logic and felt the hollow ache of being reissued with unfamiliar instructions. They encountered a court, one without marble but with the scent of old ink and the impermeable calm of people holding too much at once. The judges were not scribes nor gods, but archivists of consequence, beings who read the formations of choices and assessed them for the tiny, accumulating errors that created cosmos-level anger. Achilles had come here not as a defendant but as an instrument, a living example of the way mortal choices could reverberate like bells made of bone. In that court, Enoch spoke with the cadence of one who had been permitted to plead without interruption for things that were not his own. He argued for Achilles not on the basis of fame but on the basis of potential utility. The man who understood war could fix war's structural errors if given the tools. Achilles felt discomfort at being offered as a remedy for cosmic administrative failure, yet he also felt, surprised, a certain kind of hunger. To rebuild rather than to raise might be a labor more suited to someone who had long been praised for breaking things. The archivists accepted this unwilling conversion with a decision that felt like a hinge. They granted Achilles a kind of exile that was not exile from life but exile into multiplicity, an assignment to walk between domains and mend tears in the fabric. Enoch warned him, the task would not temper his rage or soothe his grief, it would require frequent amputations of the self. Each success would require him to relinquish a memory, a taste, a name, a pattern of thought, and those losses would accrue like coins paid for passage. Achilles accepted, because his acceptance was an old-fashioned thing. He had always been offered choices as if they were swords, and he preferred to do what required the least talking and the most immediate movement. This new mission asked for a different skill, but it still offered a kind of glory, a quiet, bureaucratic brilliance that peach-glowed when you thought of it as an antidote to endless death. He also accepted because Patroclus's absence had unstitched something in him that could only be resewn by action, even if that action was absurdly administrative in the long view. They began their work in a small village that had once been a place of exchange between gods and mortals but had been miscounted by a cleric whose notebooks had been gnawed by time. The result was a place whose prayers fell like pebbles into a pit and did not echo back. Crops failed here not because the earth was infertile but because the intention behind the songs had been misread for generations. Achilles learned to listen in a way he had not needed to before. Listening here was like learning a war strategy, only the enemy was misunderstanding itself. He sat in houses with women who had names that smelled like bread and heard histories recited in fragments. Their griefs were local and also cosmological: a child who would not grow, a well that returned blood instead of water, a seam in the sky that flickered with the rumor of frost. Achilles learned to make small devices of apology, rituals that were not reliant on beaches and spears but on gifts of presence and the willingness to take on another person's sorrow as if it were one's own armor. He was clumsy at first and then clumsy in a different way, but there was progress. The work changed him in incremental ways. Where he had once felt power as a blunt instrument, he began to feel it as patience, the slow collapse of a badly built idea into a truer form. It was a form of power that asked not for a single triumphal shout but for dozens of low, steady acts repeated until they registered. Achilles discovered an odd satisfaction in this repetition, a kind of rhythm that approximated the drumbeat of decades rather than the single trumpet of a battle song. Between tasks he would return to Enoch, and their conversations became a kind of instruction manual for a man learning to be a different sort of hero. Sometimes Enoch spoke cryptically about the metaphysics of obligation, the notion that favor is a currency you owe even to those you love. Other times he sat in silence and let Achilles tell him about the taste of wind before a charge, about the way Patroclus smiled, about how the world felt like a cloak he had been unwilling to set down. Enoch's descent, as Achilles began to understand it, had been motivated by compassion's own restlessness. He had seen, from above and below, how the structures of life tangled and how the small miscalculations of gods could cause avalanches of suffering. His choice to return to the lower rooms of the cosmos had been an abdication of unearned privilege and a taking up of care. In Enoch's company, Achilles found himself softening, not in the way heroes softened in songs, but in the way stone softens under water. The most difficult tasks were never the ones that required force. They required courage to change, willingness to be forgotten, and the patience to stand with someone while their grief shaped the day. Achilles found himself sitting with elderly men who had sacrificed gardens for oaths and who needed not his spear but his ear, and he learned the surprising artistry of being present and then letting go. Each time he succeeded, a small part of him was catalogued and sealed away. He felt the emptiness like the hollow in an instrument waiting for breath. There were days when he wanted to return to the field, to feel the simplicity of a clash where right and wrong were hammered into the same metal. Those inclinations were a kind of homesickness for his former life, and his body answered with surges of hunger for the adrenaline that had once made his world so straightforward. Enoch did not shame him for these desires. Instead, he taught Achilles how to convert them. "The force you know so well can be used to unbind rather than bind," he said, and taught him how to prod open places that had been shut with brute but precise technique. Not all his assignments were small. There were rifts in other towns where former gods had tried to hold on, their diminished forms clinging to customs that were now poisonous. Achilles would confront these revenant deities not by killing them. Few could be killed in a place that had no judges in the mortal sense, but by offering a different reality. Stories that remade their purposes so they no longer consumed what they had fed on. He understood, with an old warrior's clarity, how to take an enemy's rage and redirect it into service, like redirecting a river to irrigate drought. As he worked, Achilles felt time shift in strange intervals. Hours here could be centuries elsewhere, or simply a breath. That elasticity forced him to weigh decisions with a new metric, not what would bloom immediate vanity but what would contribute to the slow weave. He had always been tempted by immediate renown. Now he had to imagine renown as if it were a tree that took ages to root beneath the soil rather than a firework designed to break at midnight. The language of the exile changed him. He found himself thinking in metaphors of repair and conservation rather than conquest. He began to catalog the small, beautiful things of the world that had no proper poets, the way a child's scab healed into a map of future laughter, the soft fray at the edge of a mother's robe that carried the scent of home. the precise angle of a house's doorway that let in luck in autumn. These details accrued in him not as loot but as maps, and they quietly transformed his priorities. Enoch noticed these changes with a kind of paternal amusement that was both fond and resigned. He knew that any man who had been Achilles would never completely be someone else. The skeletal drive toward recognition would always be embedded like a scar. But he also knew that the man before him had become more than a myth and less than a god, and that this liminal state was useful. Achilles had become a hinge connecting reckless action with careful mending, a rare and dangerous combination. In the course of their tasks, they encountered other figures descended or fallen or misplaced, prophets translated into stone, kings who had been erased from histories and who now sat in the in-between repairing ledgers, lovers who had been separated by errors in the system and who tried, with trembling hands, to rebuild the bridge. Achilles began to see the pattern of exile, how it was both punishment and healing, both a way to be put out and to be remade. The world beyond mortal terms was not merely an afterlife but a workshop where mistakes were unspooled and reknitted. There was a particular place they came to that had been a battlefield once, a plain where the soil remembered the tread of thousands of boots. Here the dead had not departed cleanly, their voices threaded into the grass like roots and would pull at any passerby who dared to rest. Achilles sat among them and listened as the whispers stitched the names of men back into the sky. He learned how to turn such haunted spaces into places of memory rather than instruments of haunting, and the relief that washed through the plain was like a spring breaking open. He did this by learning languages of the world that had no alphabets. He learned to interpret sighs and glances, the way a child's lullaby could also be a map of navigation. At night, when they rested, Enoch taught him to read constellations not as fixed certainties but as flexing formulas, each star a variable in the ledger of human hope. Achilles learned to find patterns and to be humble in his interpretations. There were trials, inevitable as stone and tide. Some assignments failed. Sometimes a man you tried to help refused to accept another's hand and clinging to his own method of suffering, tore apart the delicate work Achilles had woven. Failure stung like winter, and each time it happened Achilles found himself mourning not only the loss of an outcome but the loss of a lesson's neatness. Enoch would sit by him, neither consoling nor distant, and together they would attempt to harvest meaning from defeat. It was in the handling of these failures that Achilles began to understand the economy of grace. He had been raised in a world that rewarded certainty, where a clean strike wiped away a problem. This place demanded that attempts be counted as part of success and that mercy be applied as often as judgment. The transformation required new muscles, the ability to apologize when one had been right, the ability to keep trying when previous tries had been lethal. As Achilles' tasks multiplied, the stories about him changed in the seeping worlds. Some songs described him as the hero who had refused to die in standard fashion, the man who took on the tedious labor of healing rather than the easy glory of slaughter. Others grew skeptical, telling of a warrior who had been diminished, who had traded swift renown for slow repair. Achilles learned to stop measuring himself by the songs of others. Instead, he began to measure himself by the quiet returns, a field that finally yielded wheat, a child whose cough vanished. At times, memory, which had always been Achilles' possession and his burden, started to hemorrhage in a literal and terrifying way. Each time he stitched a fracture between worlds, he lost a memory according to the pact he had made. Sometimes it was a name, sometimes a face, sometimes the smell of salt on a particular summer evening. These losses were not always cruel, sometimes they were merciful, erasing a tormenting recollection that had once been a bright jewel of pain. Achilles found that losing some memories was like pruning a tree, painful at first, but leaving room for new branches. He kept a small list carved into the inside of his shield, a talisman of sorts, a way to keep track of what he had given away. The list was not comprehensive, nothing could be, but it was enough to let him mourn privately. Sometimes he would touch the list and feel a hollow of recognition, a place within him that had once held a beating memory and now held a quiet. Those hollows made him tenderer, and tenderness was an unfamiliar weapon. Enoch watched these changes with a sorrow that was both ancient and immediate. He had known the price of descending and he had been willing to pay it, but watching a friend give away the scaffolding of his own identity was a different sorrow. Enoch, who had already lost so much of himself to the work, sometimes wished he could shelter Achilles from these amputations and other times recognized their necessity. He had come back into the world to balance the scales and found that balancing required the utmost cruelty at times, the removal of attachments that had become infection. They came upon a valley where the dead had been miscounted, and the catalogue of their loss had entered into the living like a slow pestilence. People forgot the names of those they loved, recollection slumped like a broken loom. Achilles knelt in the valley and began, painstakingly, to rethread memory into the fabric of the town. He read names slowly, with the cadence of a man reciting a roll call of saints. He taught the living to speak the names of the dead again, and in that act the living were unburdened. It was the kind of work not sung by bards, the kind of work that paid off in small, imperceptible increments. As he labored, a rumor traveled across the strata of stories. Achilles was becoming someone who could stand between loss and the living and not be destroyed. The rumor reached strange ears, gods who had been idle and demigods who had been sleeping on their laurels, and some were irritated. They did not understand that to get into the architecture of the world and rearrange its load-bearing parts required neither heroics nor holy violence but the stubborn employment of compassion as method. The gods who favored more theatrical solutions watched him with irritation and curiosity. One of those gods descended in person, manifesting as a hunter with eyes like starlight and a voice that could freeze fog. He accused Achilles of overstepping, of meddling in designs that were not for mortal hands. Achilles answered not with the impulsive courage of his youth, but with a new kind of speech, steady, reasoned, patient. He offered examples of consequences shifted for the better and spoke of economies of suffering reduced. The god listened, and though the god was not entirely convinced, he recognized in Achilles the sort of stubbornness that half the battles he waged abroad could not break. The tension with the gods eventually settled into a wary truce. Achilles had learned that gods often crave ceremony and visible triumph, and he rendered those desires harmless by giving them small rituals that fed their need for spectacle while also accomplishing the quieter work at hand. In some places he erected altars where there had been none, not out of devotion but as infrastructure. The gods liked these altars because they still received reverence. The villagers benefited because the altars became places where oaths could be properly made and therefore honored. Along the way, Achilles discovered that exile was not always outwardly imposed. He met men who had chosen exile for reasons subtle and private, a potter who had left his city because his craft had been used to make instruments of war, a mother who had traveled across worlds because her grief would have monstered her children if she had remained at home. These renegades were not less than victims. They were people who had seen their lives unspool and had preferred to weave them anew, and Achilles admired them for the courage of choosing the slow, lonely path of reinvention. There were dark nights when he thought he might yet prefer a spear to his new tools. The field still called him, and sometimes he felt the phantom weight of armor and the phantom ache of victories that had cost him dearly. In those moments he remembered the look on Patroclus's face the last time they had laughed, and the memory was at once a balm and a blade. He would lay awake and wrestle with this double-edged longing, sometimes waking to find Enoch's hand on his brow like a benediction. As years wore on, time measured strangely in this place. Achilles' presence became part of the geography. Children told legends about the man who mended grief, and they played at being him in the dusty lanes. Elders would tell his tales not as illusions of eternal youth, but as stories of adaptation. He became, to some, an example of what happens when a life is reallocated from spectacle to service. In quiet taverns and in market squares, people would debate whether Achilles had been diminished or enlarged by his exile, and those debates were themselves a kind of civic engagement. Achievements accumulated not as trophies but as subtle repairs. A town no longer haunted by their dead learned to plant citrus trees that tolerated the strange frost of their climate. Children in another village finally stopped coughing because someone had mended the ley line of their air, and a solitary lighthouse began to shine again after Achilles rewired a rift that had made light leak away. Each repair was small, easy to miss, and yet when they all compiled, they altered the way people lived in ways that could not be told in a single song. There were moments, brief, bright, when Achilles recognized the old thrill of battle in the form of decision undone and righted. The satisfaction of a yes that finally fit a hard place was akin to the shock of a successful charge. He learned to savor such triumphs without needing them to define him. Victory's sweetness remained but was no longer poison, it was seasoning, not sustenance. In the course of this remaking, Achilles encountered other exiles, men and women from distant myths who had been given tasks similar in spirit but different in execution. Some had chosen to be teachers, others builders, others arbiters of small peace. They were not clustered into a confraternity but recognized one another in the same way veterans do, by the flashlight in the eyes that had seen more than it was wise to see. They shared stories in the pauses between work, and their company filled Achilles' evenings with a new kind of fellowship. Enoch's descent had brought others into motion, too, those whose memories had been eaten by the obligations of being overseers and who, when returned to the fray, recognized that action was required beyond their former silences. Together, they formed a loose coalition of repairers, some skilled in law, others in craft, others in the arcane science of listening. Achilles found that being part of that coalition made his tasks less lonely, and that the coalition's dream was to make itself obsolete in places where wounds no longer reopened. Their mission, noble in design, carried contradictions. To fix the world without producing dependency meant teaching people to be architects of their own resilience. Achilles learned to build not monuments to himself, but tools that replaced the need for mythic saviors. This teaching required the utmost humility, to be the invisible hands in the machinery of ordinary life, to accept invisibility as a sign of success rather than a wound. Over and over again, he was forced to let go of the appetite for memorials. In the days when a village, newly freed from a spiritual error, wanted to carve his image onto stone, Achilles refused. He understood that immortality in bronze was a selfish demand, and so he taught them songs that praised the work of the community instead. Those songs were awkward at first, not as polished as poems of single heroes, but they suited the needs of the place because they distributed praise rather than collecting it. The cost of such renunciations was real. Achilles felt his legend softening in the world as he practiced modesty. Bards complained, festivals shifted their hymns to patronize more venerable gods, and older patrons who had once sought him were baffled. Yet the quality of people's lives improved in the quiet, and that improvement was, to the man who had loved Patroclus and mourned him for years, an adequate return on an otherwise bitter investment. Then came a challenge that tested the limits of what they had been doing. A rift opened near the root of a river that fed several nations. If it widened, it would erase countless villages. This was not a simple fix. Whoever had miscounted at the root had woven an intergenerational calculus of anger that tied weather and memory and economics together. It would require both the stubbornness of Achilles and the rarefied knowledge of Enoch, as well as the cooperation of mortals who would have to relinquish long-held resentments. They organized a campaign of persuasion that read like a military campaign but fought with different weapons: conversations, reparations, public admissions of guilt, and community ceremonies. It was the sort of work Achilles would once have dismissed as endless politicking, but now he moved through it like a captain of peace. People resisted, as people do, but the coalition's work rendered resistance more costly than submission. Slowly, the river's root healed, and the villages were spared the slow pulse of erasure. That victory was not glorious in the way of spears and songs, but it was vast in its consequence. Entire cultures subtended outward like flowers after the rain. Children born in the aftermath grew up with different expectations, with less fear of arbitrary calamity. For Achilles, the satisfaction was double. He had prevented tragedy and in doing so had prevented the making of a new mythology of suffering. He had, in other words, helped stop the very thing that might have birthed another reason for a man like Achilles to be worshipped. Years layered upon themselves, Achilles' hair silvered in small inches and the lines around his eyes deepened. The tasks continued, sometimes mundane to the point of tedium and sometimes electrifying with the gravity of near catastrophe. Enoch remained his companion and sometimes his only patient audience. The bond between them evolved into something that was both friendship and apprenticeship, each altering the other in ways that sometimes surprised even themselves. An afternoon came when Achilles encountered a child who reminded him of Patroclus in a way he had never expected, some small tilt of the chin, some mischievous curl at the mouth. The child laughed at a joke Achilles did not remember making, and the sound was a spear through him and a tapestry mended in the same instant. He realized that despite the losses, despite the amputations of memory and the slow erosion of certain pleasures, there were new joys that had different weights and different music. Despite the steady work and small triumphs, the world beyond the mortal realm sent its own rebukes. There were corridors of bureaucracy where Achilles found himself tangled in metaphysical red tape, laws that seemed to exist for the purpose of making change difficult. He and Enoch had to learn the diplomacy of rulemaking, how to bend a statute without breaking a universe. They became artisans of governance as well as hands-on repairers. Finally, as all long narratives do, this one arrived at a place of synthesis rather than resolution. Achilles had become something both recognizable and utterly foreign. He had changed as cultures do over generations. He had learned to move between the heat of the field and the coolness of long repair. He had learned that exile could be an education. Where once he had sought single moments that shimmered, he now sought long arcs that slowly accumulated into better worlds. Enoch's own path rose and fell like the skyline of a distant city. There were days when he seemed younger and evenings when he was all the older, as if his return to the lower rooms of the cosmos had not returned him in a single direction but had scattered his years like seed. He often spoke of the balance they had achieved together, of the way Achilles had become a bridge between immediate action and patient continuity. They frequently sat, in those long silences, and felt at once satisfied and unquiet. The exile that had begun as a punishment and a reassignment had become, paradoxically, a kind of home. Not the home of hearth and single narrative, but a residence in the sinews of the world, where a person can be both repairer and witness, both soldier and gardener. Achilles discovered that he could inhabit multiple identities without feeling diminished, and that was perhaps the truest change of all. He who had once been the fixed point of a song had become a continuing plot, an argument against the simplification of living. Even so, the old demons did not vanish. A vigilance remained necessary. There were always new miscounts, new misreadings, entire systems in need of translation. Achilles, now older and more patient, took these calls as a matter of duty. He had become a steward of the fragile scene between worlds, and in that stewardship he found a kind of peace that had never arrived in the form of a tombstone or epic poem, but in the slow satisfaction of a mended community. The narrative of Achilles as the fast-burning hero did not die. Bards still sang variations of the old tale in taverns and in palaces, and children still played at being a young man with a golden shield. But alongside those songs, new stories were told of a man who took exile as an education and used it to weave the world back together. People argued about which story was truer, but history, being a patient thing, contains room for both kinds of truth at once. Enoch eventually spoke of another movement, not as an instruction but as an invitation. He said that the work of repair is never complete, that exiles will always be necessary, but that those exiles can become teachers who teach the world to do better for itself. Achilles listened, and for the first time since his exile began, he thought about returning to where he was begun. Not to resume his place as a song hero, but to ensure that the conditions that had birthed his old life were redirected. He did not return in the form the world expected. He came back as a teacher of systems rather than a commander of fleets, as a man who understood that heroism could be a daily practice of small mercies and consistent labor. The public welcomed him with confusion and then, slowly, with respect of a different kind. He stood at the threshold between two states, not because he had to, but because the shape of the world required someone to be there, steady and present. In those final seasons of his long labor, Achilles sat by the same shore where he had first met Enoch. The sea was unchanged in its eternal restlessness, and yet he perceived it differently now. What had once been a theatrical border was now a vein of exchange, a place where ships could carry seeds rather than just steel. He did not leave the sea as one who deserts, but as one who understood how to read its currents to carry better hopes. Enoch stood with him, older in the way that accrues when one has used years to carve meaning rather than merely accumulate days. They spoke not of endings but of continuations. They had learned together that descent might be a way to return and that exile could be pedagogy. They had found, in the long arc of work and memory and sacrifice, a form of life that refused to fit neatly into any single song. Achilles' exile beyond the mortal realm had been a banishment and a blessing, a sentence and an education, a practical reassignment and a moral apprenticeship. He had crossed thresholds, mended rifts, traded memories for tools, and in the exchange had discovered that identity is not one thing but many. In the weaving of other people's lives back into pattern, he had found a different kind of immortality, presence in perpetuity, not because his name was carved deep into stones, but because his hands had steadied the hands of others. And so the descent of Enoch became in part a descent of Achilles, not by replication but by invitation. The two of them had moved the world enough to make space for small changes to become durable. Their exile remade what exile could mean, a long, patient labor of attention that values the living and the dead in equal measure. It was neither tidy nor triumphant in the old sense, but it was true work, and truth, in the end, is what most repairs require. In the low hours before dawn, when the world still smelled of night and the stars had not yet decided whether to go on or to be silent, there came a whisper across the hills that named an old name with a new urgency, Achilles. It was not merely a memory of a warrior, but a summons, a vibration in the marrow of the earth, as if the land itself remembered the shape of heroes and was reluctant to let them leave. From that vibration there unfolded a story that braided Greek bronze and the dusty scrolls of prophets, a story that claimed the end of an age and the last prophecy of a man called Enoch. It opened without ceremony, as prophecies so often do, in the middle of a life that thought it had grown used to endings. Enoch, in the telling, was a figure who carried light like contraband, a man who had walked with gods and come back carrying their fingerprints. He had been counted among the righteous in a time when the line between heaven and earth was porous and unstable, and he had learned to read the ledger of ages. That reading was not merely knowledge, it was the slow decoding of events into patterns, the turning of faces toward consequence. When he wrote of endings, he did so with a kind of reluctant tenderness, because to foretell is also to mourn. Achilles entered the prophecy like a comet passing the outer planets, sudden and hot and incandescent against the cold calculus of fate. He had been a child of both the mortal world and a sea-born divinity, dipped in water that could not wash away the human cost that clung to him. Songs would remember him as the greatest of warriors, but prophecies remember him differently, as a hinge upon which an entire age could swing. In Enoch's manuscript, Achilles was not just a man with a spear, he was a symbol and a question, the last of a lineage that had to be accounted for. The Age of Heroes is a strange thing to try to describe to someone who has never been taught to listen for it. It sounds at first like stories around a fire, words that swell into the night and decrease with the coming of dawn. But in truth, the age is a frequency, a cultural weather system that makes certain kinds of deeds both possible and fashionable. When it passes, the world feels the change like a sea level shift, coastlines of confidence recede, and new forms of courage must be learned. Enoch's prophecy did not speak in the Baroque language of soothsayers, it spoke in plain metaphors and slow metaphysical arithmetic. He wrote of the decline of monsters and the closing of thresholds where gods once walked openly among men. He counted battles as one might count the pages of a book, weighing the cost in names and in names lost to time. Into that ledger he placed Achilles as a final entry, a sum that would determine the balance of the centuries to come. Achilles, as a hero, had never expected to be the cause of an epic's end, nor had he expected to be called upon centuries after his clay had gone back to the earth. He had been content with glory, with the twin promises of memory and song that lingered after blood had dried. The irony that Enoch noticed, and wrote with a kind of pointed grief, was that glory is not the same as sustainability. A world that prizes heroic death over resilient life angles toward collapse when the heroic code ossifies into an ethic of sacrifice for spectacle. The prophecy unfolded in images both striking and precise, an iron spear that cast no shadow, a helmet that hummed with the voices of the dead, a plane on which men no longer carried shields but instead a litany of past victories. Enoch's hand, surprisingly modern in its sensibilities, lingered on details that a more ornate prophet might have skipped. He described the weight of armor as a thing that could make a man forget he was also flesh and bone, how the heat under a breastplate becomes a second skin, how that skin remembers every cut. The specifics mattered because they were proof that prophecy was not merely doom, but observation sharpened into consequence. There is a particular cruelty in telling someone that their era is ending when that person is built to believe in perpetual continuation. Achilles had been taught to expect immortality by reputation, which is not the same as living forever but feels like it until it is tested. When Enoch's words reached him, they landed like a slow, cold rain. He read in them a diagnosis that did not simply predict a battle but diagnosed a structural fault. A culture that keeps its doors open only to war will find other doors rusted shut. Word spread not like a fever but like the controlled leak of a dam, and with it came a motley of responses. Some bristled at the idea that heroes could be outmoded, they tightened their greaves and promised dazzle. Others saw in Enoch's words a necessary culling, an opportunity to prune what had become overgrown. Scholars argued late into candlelit nights about interpretive slants, and women who had raised sons into the war code cried in kitchens where the sounds of pots and knives translated mourning into the everyday. The debate was not abstract. It reached the fabric of villages and palaces, of temples where votive offerings gathered dust and marketplaces where traders measured the worth of weapons against the price of grain. Enoch himself was not present as an oracle on a stool, he was absent and therefore more dangerous. His writings circulated in fragments, in whispers, and the underhand exchange of parchment by those who preferred to read truth in private. This clandestine quality added weight to his words because once a thing must be hidden, it becomes precious and suspect in equal measure. People read with both reverence and irritation, as if one could be expected to be grateful for doom if it were at least written with elegance. To understand why Achilles matters in this prophecy, we must step back and look at the anatomy of heroism as a cultural construct. In the age of heroes, individuals are not merely actors, they are amplifiers of a society's valuation of courage, of honor, of dramatic resolution. Achilles embodied these amplifications to an extreme degree. His actions produced narrative consequences that echoed, like bell tones, through time. Therefore, when Enoch suggested that Achilles' final stand could be the closing argument of an epic, it meant that his death would reverberate with more structural meaning than any private loss could have. There is a certain inevitability to prophetic narratives that is both seductive and self-fulfilling. When a community accepts that its end is foretold, it may rush to enact the prophecy as if performing it were the point. This circularity worried Enoch. He recorded with a steady hand how communities, upon being told an ending, might choose to accelerate toward it by participating in spectacles of heroic death. Achilles, with his appetite for renown, was particularly vulnerable to a society that could be tempted to turn his life into a ritual closure. Achilles walked through the final months as if learning to be a historical figure, a living archive kept in motion. He observed, in quiet ways that surprised those who expected constant war, the small things that would survive him if the age truly ended: children's laughter in courtyards, the stubborn growth of ivy along temple steps, the way bread is never the same twice. He found himself cataloging details with a scholar's patience, perhaps because prophecy makes one acutely aware that every triviality can become evidence. These private inventories, though never intended for public reading, made him a fragile repository of human texture. When the nations began to shift alliances and to reallocate resources away from the maintenance of armies, the armed aristocracy felt a peculiar kind of vertigo. They were not yet ready to embrace peace, only to make room for it. Those who had built their identity on the currency of battle began to bargain for obsolescence in inventive ways, sponsoring festivals that simulated war without its danger, or proposing myths of past heroism to be commemorated in stone rather than in action. It was an attempt to freeze a way of life into the permanence of monument, which is to say they chose memory over adaptation. Enoch's words, spread like seeds, grew into different plants in different soils. In one city they inspired redesigns of the agora where young men practiced rhetoric instead of swordplay, engaging the muscle of argument rather than that of arm. In another region, they became a rallying cry for dissenters who used the prophecy to justify uprisings against ruling warlords. The multiplicity of responses confirmed Enoch's suspicion that prophecy is less a map of future events than a mirror reflecting people's desires and fears. There were those who tried to weaponize the prophecy itself. They claimed that Enoch's final verse had actually foretold the path to immortality for heroes if only they followed a particular regimen of rites and sacrifices. This claim manufactured a new religion of elective peril, and it spread faster than the old gods could protest. Achilles watched with a mix of amusement and horror as men dressed ritual in the trappings of survival, trading the possibility of a meaningful life for the theater of possible eternal fame. At the center of all this wrangling, Achilles felt the peculiar loneliness of someone who had always stood out but never expected to be a symbol of an ending. He had known how to win or lose a fight, but not how to negotiate the meaning of his life in a time when meanings were being rewritten. He found himself conversing in long silences with soldiers who had fought under his name, with poets who had made him immortal on the page, and with children who still believed that being brave meant being noticed. These conversations were attempts to stitch together a human presence from the flailing tapestry of legend. Enoch's manuscript contained a chapter that many considered the most difficult to read because it required a vocabulary of moral economics rather than mere theology. He wrote about debt, how societies take on the moral debt of heroism and expect successors to service it with fresh sacrifices. He argued that when the acts of courage demanded by the system stop being life-affirming and become debt service, civilization loses an essential elasticity. The line between noble risk and coerced ruin, he warned, is deceptively thin. The poets responded in verses that tried to reconcile Enoch's sober arithmetic with a love for the luminous moment of heroic action. They wrote of Achilles' heel not as a literal wound but as a hinge of decision where compassion might enter into the calculus of glory. Some poems softened the prophecy into elegy, rendering the end of the age as a quiet closing rather than an apocalypse. Others made the end into a trumpet call, insisting that the world must purge itself of corruption through the spectacle of purified violence. One of the quietest but most consequential outcomes of Enoch's prophecy was the change in how ordinary people measured worth. No longer did a household's prestige hinge only on the battlefield anecdotes of a son. Instead, the stories of those who healed, who cultivated, who made peace began to gain purchase. This shift did not happen instantly, and it did not go unopposed. But little by little the cultural ledger balanced, and with every small correction the scaffolding of heroic dependence loosened. Achilles noticed the shift in the marketplaces more than in the barracks. He saw merchants trading stories about the benefits of nonviolent trade routes and watched blacksmiths who had once specialized in spearheads begin to raise looms. These were not signs of a softening so much as a reallocation of human energy. Achilles, who had once defined himself through combat, found in these transformations a kind of relief and disorientation in equal measure. Enoch's text also contained a startlingly modern political commentary that made many uncomfortable. He posited that systems which perpetuate heroic suffering are, in fact, engineered to concentrate power. By glorifying individual acts of violence, rulers can distract from systemic failures and use hero worship as a currency to buy compliance. This notion, when written in the archaic hand of a man who walked with angels, cut like a scalpel through the religious platitudes that sustained many rulers. There were, naturally, voices that mocked or dismissed Enoch as a false prophet. They held up his predictions as the scribblings of a man who had failed to read the true signs of fortune. Yet their denunciations often rang hollow because they could not answer the empirical evidence Enoch cited: the dwindling returns from wars, the internal impoverishment of states addicted to spectacle, the rising voices of those left to shoulder the consequences. Objects do not always need prophecy to reveal the truth. Sometimes they simply are what they are, and prophecy is the name we give to clarity. As the end of the age drew nearer, rituals changed shape. Funerary rites became longer as communities tried to translate irrevocable loss into meaning that might be passed down. In some places, funerals began to include offerings not to gods but to future gardeners and teachers, a radical act of paying forward the cost of peace. Achilles, who had once delighted in battle chant and funeral pyre, found his presence at these ceremonies both jarring and profound. He was learning, late in life, how to stand in a crowd that grieved without burning houses in retribution. One day, in a village that had once sent a disproportionate number of its sons to distant wars, Achilles met a woman who had lost both husband and brother to a pointless border clash. She did not ask him for vengeance. Instead, she shared with him a handful of seeds, saying that the best memorial would be a garden to feed children. Her words, spoken without grand rhetoric, were like a compass that pointed away from the ruin of spectacle. Achilles carried those seeds with him until the end of his wandering, and they became a private liturgy of repair. Enoch's prophecy cast a long shadow on the battlefield as well. Generals who had once depended upon heroic feats for victory began to recalibrate, favoring strategies that preserved manpower and emphasized planning over the caprice of valor. This was not universal. There were those who clung to the theatrics of war and who orchestrated charges meant less for tactical gain than for public consumption. The tension between spectacle and strategy was the signature conflict of the period, and it produced both progress and tragedy in equal measure. At the heart of the transition was an ethical conversation about what societies owe to their young and how to measure the price of glory. Enoch asked bluntly whether any civilization that expects perpetual youth to sacrifice itself for the myth of greatness can call itself just. This question resonated beyond the wealthy courts into the small rooms where parents argued about whether to teach their children the art of spear or the art of negotiation. The argument itself was transformative because it turned the private business of raising a child into a public statement about the future. There were legends, easy to tell and even easier to believe, that Achilles had himself made a bargain with death to secure the survival of a way of life. These stories, which Enoch treated with skepticism, were attempts to ascribe a neat moral arc where none existed. Achilles was not a saint. He was a man whose courage had been both his fortune and his chain. To reduce him to an actor in a cosmic bargain would have been to remove the messy, human choices that made him real. In the later years of his life, Achilles' reputation ripened into complexity. Some continued to sing him as a paragon of unquestioned heroism, while others painted him as a man who had learned to love other things than glory. He accepted both assessments, not through vanity but with the simple recognition that human beings are interpretable objects, and that history will always have multiple hands painting different portraits. He no longer tried to police his narrative. Instead, he chose to live in such a way that future storytellers would have material to argue over. Enoch, when he wrote of Achilles, placed particular emphasis on the notion of choice. The last prophecy hinged not on an unavoidable doom but on the accumulation of decisions, small ones that erode systems and large ones that redirect them. Achilles' own choices, from refusing to fight certain fights to choosing to tend a garden in late life, were catalogued as evidence that the end of the age was not simply a collapse but a curating. Enoch seemed to believe that endings can be gentle if guided by conscious hands. As the cultural center of gravity moved from battlefield to workshop, from altar to assembly, craftsmen and scholars took on new prestige. The smith who repurposed broken spearheads into plowshares became as respected in some circles as the captain who spared an enemy's life for a ransom. This revaluation created new economies of esteem, and with them came new laws and institutions that reflected a less martial ethos. Enoch recorded these changes with cautious approval, noting that institutions rarely change in a single season but sometimes shift in rhythm. There were, inevitably, moments of backlash. Men who had lost status due to the decline of the heroic code tried to restore their power through nostalgia-based politics, promising to return the old glory if only they were given command. Their speeches were embroidered with images of destroyed honor and of the supposed decadence of peace. But the populace, influenced by their grief and by Enoch's sober accounting, did not uniformly accept the siren song. Many preferred the prospect of steady bread over the magnificent feast of spectacle. Achilles, who had seen the currency of fame erode, had a complicated relationship to the new values. He admired the artisan who saved lives by designing better harnesses and admired the teachers who taught negotiation skills to squabbling tribes. At the same time, something in him mourned the absence of the battlefield's clarity, where obligations were as sharp as swords and identities were simple. The tension between longing for simplicity and embracing complexity is a human theme that Enoch's prophecy magnified rather than solved. One of the most enduring images preserved in Enoch's text is that of Achilles standing on a hill in the evening, watching a procession of farmers carrying lanterns to a communal granary. The lanterns looked for all the world like a constellation of low stars moving with a deliberate, patient rhythm. Enoch wrote that Achilles felt both alien and at home, as if the world had learned a new grammar of valor and he was still learning the letters. It is a tender portrait of a hero learning to live in a post-heroic vocabulary. The end of the age did not erase heroism, it transformed it. Acts of courage did not disappear, but their contexts changed. Heroes were still needed, but they were increasingly the kind who could mediate disputes, who could build bridges and negotiate treaties, who understood systems and not merely swords. Achilles became emblematic of this transformation when he used his influence to broker the release of prisoners and to establish schools for young men and women. His reputation, rechanneled, became a resource for reconstruction. In describing this shift, Enoch offered a new taxonomy of bravery that included patience, restraint, and endurance as forms of valor. He argued that the smallest and most tedious acts, delivering food across winter floors, nursing the sick, teaching reluctant children, require a steadiness that is as heroic as the flare of a battle charge. Those who had lived in the age of spectacle were slow to learn this recalibration, but once it was taught, it took root. Achilles himself, who had been a thunderbolt, found meaning in the quiet gravity of constancy. Theological authorities were divided on whether the decline of the martial ethos signaled divine displeasure or a necessary evolution. Some priests seized the moment to declare a new doctrine that converted violent glory into spiritual trial. Others resisted, insisting that the old gods would be affronted by the abandonment of altar tribute. These debates had real material consequences, as temples that once sponsored companies of soldiers redirected tithes to schools and public works. The gods, if they were listening, were being asked to adapt too. Enoch, whose life had been folded into the edges of heaven, wrote that divine beings are not immune to cultural evolution. He suggested that gods change in the minds of their worshippers as surely as languages change with each generation. This observation made certain temple elders uncomfortable, but it also offered hope. If divine attention flows where humans bind it, then the very idea of sanctity could be expanded to include the sanctity of ordinary care. This semantic shift altered the moral economy of towns and cities alike. Not every life benefited from the end of the age. There were communities that collapsed because they had been built on the export of martial services. Families who had prospered on the mercenary trade found themselves adrift, and tragedy followed as debts came due. Enoch did not pretend that the end of the age was a blissful transition for all. He described it as a painful reallocation of resources, an economic pivot that demanded empathy alongside reform. His compassion for the dispossessed was one of the warming currents in his text. In some borderlands, young men who felt discard took up banditry, forming fractious groups that preyed on the weak rather than returning to legitimate work. These bands were dangerous precisely because they dramatized the old code without the checks that once existed in a more structured heroic economy. Achilles, who had once fought such men as enemies, sometimes found himself negotiating with them to prevent massacres. He used his moral authority to argue that there are better ways to regain dignity than by preying on the vulnerable. Achilles' relationship to death changed as well. No longer did he see it as an inevitable currency in which honor is traded. He began to understand mortality as a scaffold that holds life up, not as a means of purchasing immortality. This philosophical unmooring made him a better leader in small ways and a more controversial figure in others, especially among those who would have preferred the moral clarity of old certainties. Enoch admired this development and wrote of Achilles as a case study in moral maturation. The landscape of art and memory transformed under the influence of the prophecy. Sculptors who once immortalized dynamic combat scenes switched to portraits of hands at work, subtle renderings of people knitting, a baker shaping dough, a teacher tracing letters in ash. Musicians softened their rhythms. The flutes that had once accompanied war marches now played melodies to accompany communal labor. Even the language changed, acquiring new metaphors that made endurance and stewardship aesthetically prized. As the social institutions shifted, legal codes were rewritten to reflect a lower tolerance for violence and a higher reward for restorative justice. Judges who once rewarded blood feuds with ceremonial honor began to prioritize reparative settlements. There were missteps. A rush to impose norms often produced rigid laws that lacked nuance, but in many places the recalibration led to fewer cycles of revenge. Enoch's writing on law reflected a belief that societies can legislate compassion if they are willing to reimagine their incentives. Stories are where the fiercest battles over meaning took place. Epic poets and playwrights contested the narrative around Achilles with passion. Some plays ended with him falling in glorious combat, others retold the arc of his life as a tragedy redeemed by acts of reconciliation. The public appetite for different endings testified that people were still trying to negotiate what it meant to be human in a world where the old modes of honor had been challenged. This cultural conversation was messy and noisy and therefore, in Enoch's eyes, alive. The final chapters of Enoch's manuscript are unusually intimate, centering not on grand battles but on the domestic terrain where real choices are made. He detailed how Achilles taught his adopted children to read and to question, how he apologized for past harms, how he learned to sit with grief without turning it into a call to arms. These moments, small and domestic, felt revolutionary because they suggested that the true work of ending an era is not done by decrees but by patient, repeated acts of better judgment. When the last fight that would be called the Age of Heroes unfolded, it did not have the quality of mythic finality many expected. Instead, it was complicated and small, a skirmish that could have been resolved with conversation but was not. Achilles, who had been offered the role of central combatant, refused to be the face of terminal reconciliation by being its instrument of death. He stepped aside and sent emissaries instead of charges, and the skirmish ended with oddness, injured men, some bruised egos, a treaty as thin as tissue but still a treaty. That treaty, fragile though it was, had outsized symbolic power. The fact that the hero of legends declined to close the age by dying in spectacular fashion undermined the very engine that had propelled the heroic economy. If Achilles could accept life without a final masterpiece of valor, perhaps others could accept less spectacular but more sustainable choices. The psychology of imitation proved that symbols can reorient behavior as swiftly as laws do. Enoch concluded his writings not with a thunderous revelation but with an ask, an ethical injunction to remember that every age creates its own idols and that idols must be examined. He implored readers to care for the living and to preserve stories without letting them calcify into compulsory ritual. This soft charge was radical because it demanded ongoing participation. Prophecy, after all, is only as meaningful as the attention it receives. The memory of Achilles, after his death, became a polyphonic chorus. In some strains he remained a tragic warrior, in others a pioneer of peacetime values. Monuments to him appeared in multiple forms, statues with swords turned into plowshares, schools bearing his name, songs that both mourned and celebrated. The multiplicity of memorials testifies to the way societies negotiate change, by refusing a single story for the sake of a tapestry of meanings. Enoch's manuscript itself became a contested artifact. Some claimed it was divinely inspired, others said it was an exercise in moral philosophy disguised as a revelation. It traveled in secret for a time, then was copied widely, and later translated into forms that sometimes distorted its original intent. Yet even in these mutated forms the central theme endured. The end of the Age of Heroes was not an absolute cessation but a reconfiguration of values and practices. Generations later, the immediate memory of that transition softened into legend, and the lessons Enoch wrote became the bones of ethical instruction for communities far removed from the original events. Schools taught from adapted versions of his text, but they also added local amendments that emphasized different virtues. This process, the metamorphosis of prophecy into pedagogy, was the real achievement of the age's end, because it turned a moment of crisis into a durable conversation about how we live together. Historians who came centuries after Enoch would debate the degree to which the Age of Heroes actually ended or simply transformed into a new configuration of power. They argued about causality. Did Enoch cause change, or did he merely name what was already occurring? These debates, spirited and often inconclusive, underscore a truth Enoch had sensed: naming a phenomenon can shape it, but it rarely causes it outright. The interplay between recognition and action is messy and mutual. In quiet corners of society, where cook fires still burned and elders told stories to children at bedtime, the old myths persisted as comforting background music. Parents told tales of Achilles not to glorify war but to teach children about complexity, the way a good person may do harm and yet be capable of learning. This kind of storytelling kept the memory alive without demanding doctrinal fidelity. It allowed myth to be a living, interpretive practice rather than a fossil. As for Achilles himself, his legacy reached past the human sphere in some accounts. Trees planted where he had paused to rest grew thick and strong, and some said the earth in those places seemed to hold a quieter moisture, as if the ground remembered a man who refused to end a world through spectacle. Birds nested in the branches and sang songs that, to certain listeners, sounded like thank you notes from the not-quite-human world. These natural echoes were poetic rather than evidentiary, but they suffused the landscape with a sense of continuity that complemented Enoch's moral architecture. The Age of Heroes, Enoch wrote, had taught humanity about the extremes of human possibility, great courage, greater cruelty, and the fragile elegance of fame. Its ending taught the same people about the equal necessity of stability and care, of institutions that sustain life and of small acts that accumulate into cultural currents. The end was not a single event but a long, slow resculpting of priorities, a migration from the worship of extraordinary death to a reverence for ordinary life. Readers of the prophecy in later eras often find themselves surprised by its practical orientation. Enoch did not simply announce doom and then vanish. He cataloged policies and personal practices that could make a transition less brutal. He suggested agricultural reforms, communal defense strategies that preserved lives, and educational reforms that prioritized dispute resolution. His pragmatism is one reason his work continued to be cited by reformers seeking to justify structural change. The emotional tenor of the era's closing was complicated, a mix of relief, nostalgia, resentment, and hope. People kept mourning the good parts of the old era, its clear narratives and thrilling moments, even as they welcomed the less spectacular but more bearable forms of living that replaced them. Grief ran like a river beneath the social landscape, sometimes flooding into the public square in outbursts of resentment, and sometimes being channeled into memorials and stories that made mourning communal rather than paralyzing. In a private letter that Enoch enclosed in some copies of his manuscript, he described a dream in which he walked with Achilles down a long corridor lined with portraits of both petty men and magnanimous ones. In the dream, Achilles did not stand out. He looked like every human who had loved and erred, who had been brave and remorseful. Enoch described that image as hopeful because it suggested a world where heroes are people among people rather than pedestal gods whose fall requires a cosmic reset. To many, the greatest moral that emerged from the end of the Age of Heroes was simple, institutionalized compassion. That meant designing political and economic systems that did not require endless sacrifice for legitimacy. It meant creating incentives for peace and welfare, not just for victory in combat. Enoch wrote that this institutionalization is tedious, slow, and easy to sabotage, and yet it is the only reliable path to the life he envisioned. Centuries later, when the old texts were re-examined, artists and thinkers found in Enoch's pages an urgent voice that spoke across epochs. They lifted lines and reinterpreted them for new contexts. Abolitionists read the manuscripts as ethical proof that sacrifice had been exploited by elites, while peacemakers used the text as a blueprint for conflict resolution. The adaptability of Enoch's thought is its genius, because it allowed his prophecy to be a living document rather than a dead relic. In towns that maintained archives, children were taught to debate Enoch in civic assemblies, sharpening their rhetorical skills while learning to grapple with ethical dilemmas. This practice created generations of citizens who were, by default, accustomed to moral complexity. They learned that policy is not simply the enforcement of idealized values but the negotiation of messy trade-offs. Achilles' example, ever mutable, fed into those debates as both a cautionary tale and a guide. When scholars tried to reconstruct the precise sequence of events that led to the age's end, they found contradictions and overlaps. Different regions experienced the decline in different patterns, and the variables were many: climate, trade networks, plague, and the personalities of rulers. Yet a common thread in most explanations was cultural resilience, the capacity of communities to redirect energies and to find substitutes for the roles once played by heroes. Enoch's text contributed to that resilience by making a coherent case for change. There was a persistent myth that the age of heroes had ended with a single sacrificial act, but in truth the end took longer than any single life. It unspooled over years and decades, and it was ratified by ordinary choices as much as by treaties and decrees. Achilles, in that context, functioned as a catalytic figure whose decisions mattered not because he alone determined the outcome but because he shaped the cultural climate in ways that made change plausible. Enoch's prophecy has an odd humility that distinguishes it from other apocalyptic literature. It never insists on its own infallibility, it invites criticism and correction. This humility made it durable, as it did not demand blind obedience but rather participation in an ongoing moral conversation. The text itself became a civic instrument, a mirror to show the ways a people might harm themselves if they confused drama with virtue. In the end, the age of heroes faded not because heroes were immoral but because the structure that rewarded certain forms of heroism became maladaptive. Courage remained necessary, but it found new outlets: disaster relief, public health, community organization, and the patient work of repairing what violence had broken. Achilles' final days, lived with less adrenaline and more accountability, stood for that new distribution of courage. The last lines describes attribute to Enoch, written with a tremor that may have been age or awe, are not melodramatic. They insist that societies be judged by how they sustain their weakest members and by the stories they tell about worth. He asked for a memory that honors both the valor of the past and the commitments of the present. It is an injunction that, like any good prophecy, asks not to be obeyed but to be engaged. Those who later spoke of the end of the age of heroes understood by then that endings are often porous thresholds rather than sharp walls. New cultures took elements from the old and adapted them, preserving the instinct for courage while learning to orient it toward longevity rather than spectacle. Achilles' name persisted as a moral touchstone because he had traversed both eras. He served as a bridge between a world that valorized heroic death and one that increasingly prized resilient life. When you drive past a field where, some loose tradition tells you, Achilles once walked, or when you pass a school that claims his patronage, you are touching a layered history. There is a kind of continuity that runs through the centuries. Human beings wrestle with how to be honorable without spooling their societies into cycles of violence. Enoch's prophecy and Achilles' reluctant transformation are two edges of that same inquiry. Their conversation invites us to consider what is demanded of us when our time asks for different virtues than those our ancestors revered. In the hush after the last recorded battle, when the work of rebuilding began in earnest, people discovered that everyday kindnesses have an accumulative power that is, in its own way, heroic. The new heroism was slow and required patience, but it was durable. Markets stabilized, crafts flourished, and children received instruction in both reading and in the ethics of care. Achilles, who had once been the apex of martial distinction, became a symbol of transition, a proof that human beings can change the terms by which they measure excellence. If there is a single image that captures the final emotional contour of the age, it might be Achilles planting a tree. He chose a place where the soil had been trampled and sluggish, and with hands that had known sword and spade he set a sapling into the earth. The act is modest and untheatrical, and that modesty is the point. The end of an age is not always a trumpet blast, but sometimes a quiet reorientation of human attention toward future growth. Enoch, who had an eye for the irreducibly human, lingered on that image as a kind of moral last line. Centuries later, the story of Achilles and Enoch continues to resonate because it models a method for handling cultural transition. It offers a map not of specific policies but of the ethical posture necessary to make decisions that outlive us, to prioritize repair over show, life over spectacle, and stewardship over inheritance by bloodline. These are timeless questions dressed in the costume of a particular time, but their resonance persists because all societies must at some point learn to value what preserves them. Listeners who encounter this story on some ordinary evening might be tempted to see it as a nostalgic parable, a quaint reminder that heroes should sometimes retire gracefully. That is true, but the narrative reaches further. It insists that every age must ask whether its institutions and symbols are serving life or simply aggrandizing a select few. Enoch and Achilles stand in this tale as interlocutors, teaching us that prophecy is less about foretelling than about moral provocation. The last prophecy, as told by Enoch, is not a valediction but an invitation. It invites us to look at our own time with the same combination of rigor and tenderness. It asks whether our own heroes are enabling a sustainable future or whether they distract us with ephemeral glory. This question is uncomfortable because it implicates us in the systems we inherit, but the discomfort is useful. It pushes toward honest evaluation and, if we are willing, toward meaningful change. As the story drifts from the parchment to the air, the listener might find themselves thinking of contemporary echoes, the celebrities of the modern age, the political spectacles, the ways fame can both inspire and cannibalize. The ancient narrative is not a history lesson only, it is a lens through which to view modern dilemmas. Achilles and Enoch, though distant in time, speak across the centuries because they pose a dilemma that routinely returns to human societies: how to honor bravery while avoiding the glorification of ruin. If Enoch's prophecy has a final practical implication for our lives today, it is this: we must invest in the ordinary acts that sustain communities and be wary of rituals that transform sacrifice into spectacle. We must design institutions that reward life-enhancing courage and that provide outlets for youthful vigor that do not require blood as proof. Above all, we should remember that the end of an age is often a long negotiation and that the presence of a single luminous figure, be it Achilles or some modern analog, never absolves a society of collective responsibility. So the story goes on, in the way that good stories go on, by being retold and reinterpreted, by serving as a mirror and a warning. Achilles' spear was broken down and remade into a plowshare in some versions of the tale, and in others his spear remains a symbol of a past that taught useful lessons. Enoch's manuscript survives in fragments and in spirit, appearing wherever people argue about whom to honor and why. Both figures remain active in the moral imagination because their narratives continue to help communities decide what kind of future to make. When the road you are traveling curves by an ancient ruin or a modest memorial plaque, perhaps you will think of Achilles not as a relic but as a participant in a long human conversation about ends and means. Enoch's voice invites us to participate in that conversation rather than to outsource moral decisions to heroes. It invites us to tend the common garden and to plant saplings for figures who will be born into a more stable world. Their combined story is a sort of pedagogy. It teaches us how to be custodians of a future where heroism need not be a demand of death but a practice of sustaining life. Stories like this remind us that real strength is in care, not just in battle. Subscribe and share in the comments what speaks more to you, remembering old lessons or planting something new for the next generation.